Hey guys, welcome back to the Demystify Sci podcast. I'm Michael Shiloh,
I'm Anastasia.
and today we are speaking with Dr. Zender and Dr. Canuto from Tulane University. They study Mayan civilization, and we are very interested in the cycle of civilization, the way that societies are built up and form cities and then disappear, sometimes rather quickly, sometimes rather slowly, back into a more subsistence level way of living. And the conversation was wide ranging. We
That's unusual.
investigate everything from the nature of human sacrifice to the changing circumstances that lead to collapse and how they might map onto our civilization today, what we could do to buttress ourselves against these kind of unfun fates.
And also how much of history is missing. Because one of the greatest challenges of archaeology, which both Dr. Zender and Dr. Canuto are well acquainted with, is that what we're doing is we're taking pieces of history that are separated from each other in time and context and trying to weave them into a cohesive story of what might have happened. And so that means archaeology is a deeply interpretive pastime. And people like, say, Graham Hancock are willing to come in and to make very wildly different interpretations from those that are accepted within the community. And so towards the end of the conversation, we also spend a lot of time dealing with what it means to propose a theory that works.
And how to do that, right? I know a lot of our listeners have their own scientific ideas about how things might work. One thing we want to move towards is learning how to bring these ideas from outside to inside of an establishment and really have them be integrated into human knowledge base and into our understanding as a whole. So we came down on different sides of a lot of that stuff, and I think it made for an interesting discussion. But let us know what you think in the comments.
If you like what we do, share it with a friend. If you have already shared it with a friend, consider coming over to our Patreon. We're at patreon.com/demystifysci. Our goal is to be able to do this full time, and in order to do that, we need your help. So if you enjoy these conversations, consider supporting us. And in the meantime, enjoy a conversation with Dr. Canuto and Dr. Zender.
The scientific revolution starts now.
Demystify Sci podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
We tend to forget how young the American experiment is. I mean, 1776 is nothing compared to how long Maya civilization lasted. And then, of course, Maya civilization went through profound transformations every couple of hundred years, too. So it's
we have here where Mark and I are sitting. We're in the office. Right across the hallway from us is a little exhibit gallery that we have, and in there we have a plaster cast of a monument from a Maya city called Copan that has this famous altar. It's called Altar Q. It's quite famous. It has all of its 16 kings sort of sitting on their various thrones, kind of connected to one another, right? And it's basically representing the, in theory, unbroken chain of kingship that started in the 5th century and went on until the 8th century, right? And when I talk to students about this, and it shows essentially the first king of this dynasty passing on the scepter of power, this kind of totem of power, to the 16th ruler, right? And so it's a fantastical image. It never actually historically happened, because they were separated by 400 years. But when I tell students about this, I was like, this is 400 years of history on this stone. We haven't gotten to 300 yet in our own country, right? So imagine one city-state celebrating 4 centuries worth of kingship or statehood of some kind, right? Versus versus our own country, which we think is so long-lasting, and it kind of puts everything a bit in perspective.
How ironic, too, that it was commissioned by the last of those kings.
Right.
There's nothing beyond it, unfortunately. It was right on the eve of the collapse. Yeah.
It sort of looks like it was the 16 rulers, right? It looks like the 16th was grasping at straws to make
who knows? Maybe that was part of it. He felt like he's slipping, and so said, "Okay, this is the time to trot out George Washington all the way down to me." Yeah, exactly.
Well, the Soviet Union famously loved its monuments to its rulers, and The statues coming down was kind of emblematic because of that, I feel like.
When I was growing up, my parents would always talk about the absurdity of military awards, and we were watching, there's a new Adam Curtis documentary called Trauma Zone. And there's actually all these shots of these Russian generals, and their military ordinances take up, like the entire side of the jacket from the shoulder down to the waist, and they're just like, puffed up walking around. You're like, I don't know about that strategy.
Yeah, I always saw them and looked at and thought of fruit salad. The little colors and all the little man. It's like, it looks like a nice fruit salad of decoration up there.
So when those kings were going through when there was this procession of kings throughout these hundreds of years, were they changing their system of government at all, or was it pretty much the same model the entire time?
Well, I mean, if we think about this gap, this monument that Marcello's talking about, this is from the early 5th century till the late 8th century. So about 350 years, 16 rulers, father to son, but also with a couple of sidesteps in the dynasty. For the most part, it's the same system of government with a king, but the fortunes of those kings were different in different eras, so that you had the 13th, should have been able to predict that just from his number, was the unluckiest of the group. the sort of overlordship that his city had reigned for multiple generations before him over a nearby neighbor inverted at that point. He was captured, he was killed. The city, was tribute indebted for a couple of generations of kings at the very, very least, until they reached a kind of stability again between them, or a partnership at the very, very end. So the fortunes radically changed. You went from a very, very local superpower with a lot of, you could call it external political control, to a complete loss of that external control, to a kind of peer sort of relationship with nearby polities at the very, very end. So even over that 350 years, although you can represent it as an unbroken chain of rulers, their political fortunes, their political influences, their success in military or tribute or tax gathering was very different from ruler to ruler.
And you can see. Go ahead.
Go ahead. Sorry.
I just want to hear more about the patterns of the success and failure of those different strategies. Actually, before we get too deep, though, maybe you guys could just introduce yourselves, since we generally only we haven't done a lot of shows with two people, and I think it's best to make sure that everybody understands who's talking.
Makes sense.
Absolutely. Pearls before swine, Marcello.
Okay, well, thank you. I guess. No. Well, hi, my name is Marcello Canuto. I'm a professor of anthropology at Tulane University, and I'm also the director of the Middle American Research Institute at Tulane, which is an institute that focuses on the study of the indigenous societies of Mexico and Central America.
I'm Marc Zender. I'm an associate professor in anthropology, and I also teach in the interdisciplinary linguistics program here at Tulane University. So my focus is on Mayan languages and their history, and the epigraphy, the Maya hieroglyphic writing, and its history and trajectory over about 2,000 years of use.
And we're really glad to have you, because we want to understand the ways in which societies rise, thrive, and fall. It seems apparent that all societies must fall, because there has never been one that hasn't. And so, presumably, that's kind of like a natural law of the universe. But there seem to be societies that manage to live for a very long time. And no one seems to really have a full picture of why it is that they fall. There's many theories, there's many visions, but it's very interpretive, because you're looking back at these. We were talking about these stone tableaus that have carvings in them, where you're interpreting from it and you're trying to read the language and figure out things that surely must have some aspect of self-aggrandizement in them. And so it's a fascinating question for me, of what we know about these old societies, how accurate it is, and what can we say about the world that we live in.
Yeah, maybe we can just start off by checking out how the paradigms have shifted in your own careers in terms of understanding these we're talking about the Mayan civilization, but really the roots of culture, the roots of civilization in the Americas, I guess, because it seems like they stem both from South America, but also from Mesoamerica. And maybe we could just hear a bit about how the paradigms have shifted in your lifetimes.
Sure. I'll take a stab, and then Marc, you want to give a. So one thing to keep in mind, both of us, as we said, we were both specialists in the Maya civilization, and one of the things that has been interesting about this particular civilization is that it's been of interest to Euro-American society for hundreds of years because of certain characteristics that are, frankly, or were thought to be unique to it for a long time. Now we've come to learn that the Maya society, in terms of writing and certain other accomplishments, as people say, quote unquote accomplishment, shares a lot of other, shares it with other civilizations in Mesoamerica as well. But for a long time, one of the kind of, how do I put this? One of the sort of basic characteristics of Maya society was that it was literate. It had a writing system, right? Whether it could be read or not, whether it could be interpreted or not, didn't matter. It meant that it was a literate society of the Americas. And that really interested scholars in the 19th century about it. In fact, there were explorers and travelers and all sorts of other historians and so forth of that time period who would do kind of what we would imagine, what we think of ourselves as hardy folks that go out in the jungle and work hard in these difficult places. Well, take away all the modern amenities, even in a modern setting, even in a modern jungle setting. These folks were doing all of this 200 years ago. Basically diving into the jungle and finding and looking for what they would term as lost cities and so forth. Right. So there was this real sense of exploration with the ancient Maya that was related in part to the environment in which it's now found, or the state of the environment in which they developed, and this idea that there was this literate sort of literate American society that would be interesting to study, right? And so this from the 1800s onward. Now, as a result of that, there were theories. This is my position on this. Theories were always ahead of the data, right? There were people, I think that people thought they knew more about the Maya before they, in a way that was entirely unsupported by what they actually knew and what we actually could know at the time. And that's been sort of, I think, sort of an interesting point that people have always thought they've known more about the Maya than we actually could support with data. Perhaps that's true around the world, but certainly there is this sense of fascination with the society, and therefore theories abounding, especially regarding what happened to them, their collapse, and so forth. Right? There's this kind of romantic notion that they collapsed and then they disappeared. Right? That's probably the most common question that we receive as Mayan is what happened to the Mayan, right? Because of this notion, like you were talking about, a decline. And one of the things that you quickly learn when you start studying ancient civilizations in general is that there's a big difference between political collapse and cultural collapse, even if that concept can exist, which I don't really believe it can, right? In other words, there's this notion that there was a system and there were various systems that were developed through a very long period of time that were at different times more centralized, more politically hierarchical, and other times less, that developed over a long period of time, developed and declined over a whole sort of 3,000-year history. But that has little to do with the notion that there are Maya people today that speak Mayan languages, that maintain Maya beliefs, that tell stories, that record their own histories, and so forth. And so there's kind of a balance that we always have to maintain about studying the political, economic, and social systems that were developed by a society and how they might have at some point declined or collapsed, and then also understanding that there is a complex tapestry of people, cultures, languages, and ideologies and religions and so forth that still represent that still are found today in I would say relatively healthy condition, right? By no means perfect, but you can know that there's an area that has millions of Maya speakers, right? They're not gone, right? The Maya people are there. They make up a very important part of the modern countries of Belize, of Guatemala, Mexico, and so forth.
So we might look forward to a modern. I'm sorry. We might look forward to a modern Mayan civilization at some point, 100 years, 300 years.
I think. Hold on.
Why not? Sure.
I think that when we talk about the change, we talk about the tendency to build basically what amounts to being skyscrapers. Right? And so there's a phase change where they go from building skyscrapers to no longer building skyscrapers. And that's an interesting thing because maybe they decided that they didn't want to anymore. There's many different ways in which that shift could happen, but I feel like that's the question that's interesting. It's like certainly the Mayan people have survived because that's just
what's cool is if you look at Rome or something, right? It disappears for a while. But we essentially have very Roman-looking state buildings, our court systems. We use Latin in the courts and in medicine, right? It's almost like the civilization went to sleep for 1,000 years, well, more than that, and popped back up all of a sudden. I wonder if there isn't some cyclicism. We think about it in terms of collapse, it's gone, but I don't know. I think what you're getting at is maybe things persist culturally in a way that allows them to, I don't know. You didn't make the case that it allows them to pop back up. I'm throwing that out there, but No,
but those are really good points. I mean, we don't want to lose track on the one hand of the fact that when the Goths sacked Rome several times, lots of people died. Many people had to leave behind all of their belongings and their homes. Many people were pressed into slavery and hauled off to North Africa, where Gothic states were. So it is true that there is some cultural continuity of what was Rome, and of course, a continuing sort of beating heart of sort of Roman politics and jurisprudence in the Eastern Roman Empire as opposed to the Western Roman Empire. And then some of those cultural features could, continue and transform and return or be adopted, by new peoples. But we still have a kind of, demographic catastrophe at a couple of different time periods for the collapse of Rome. And so these people that were building, pre-Columbian, skyscrapers in the jungles of Guatemala, there's a lot of, very devastating ends to those long trajectories and traditions. So even though there are still, of course, Maya today, and there are undoubtedly still descendants of some of those peoples, there was a pretty grievous loss, in this early 9th century period that took a lot of time to recover from. If it hadn't, of course, explorers coming in the 19th century, 1,000 years later, wouldn't still find jungles full of ruins. Would have been repopulated. It would have been recolonized at some point, and that's starting to happen now, of course.
You could make the argument now, talking about the societal, economic, social, and political, and then demographic collapse that you were talking about, that the area in which the classic Maya civilization flourished, and also the pre-classic Maya civilization flourished for over 1,000 years, is still living that collapse, in the sense that after the demographic peak, we think around the 7th and 8th and the 9th centuries, the area has not recovered that population yet, right? It's probably beginning to. I don't have the latest population numbers from that region, but certainly for the last 1,000 years, from basically 1,000 AD to the modern day, the general area we understand of the lowland Maya region, that's sort of the area that involves Mexico, Belize, and northern Guatemala and eastern Mexico. Those areas there continue to be underpopulated relative to the classic period.
And
getting back to what? So I'm so sorry, Anastasia. Go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
I just wanted to, talking about what Marcello spoke about at the beginning, about the 19th century explorers and these, vast jungle just full of ruins, right? And then the slow learning bit by bit about features of their writing system and about their archaeology. Marcello mentioned already that, theories or ideas of who the Maya were always far in advance of what the data allowed, but it's also a bit of a function of the evidence. So the first thing they could read of the hieroglyphs were the numbers and the dates, and suddenly they could talk. They had a kind of chronological skeleton, but they didn't really know anything about, who these people were, exactly how they were connected. The gap between being able to date monuments and cities and find out, when the collapse occurred, and being able to read anything about what was happening on those dates was a huge one. It was basically between 1880 and the early 1950s is kind of where that started. So you have 2 or 3 generations of scholarship, basically reading between the lines, as it were, trying to fill out that particular feature. And so it took a long time before we could read enough of the texts that we started to have a sense of what they were writing historically, what the interactions among city-states were like, and start to have a kind of a picture of Maya society on the eve of that change. And at the same time, archaeology progressed beyond just, beating through pathless tracts of jungle to, spending months and years and multiple seasons mapping things. And then, of course, brand new technologies came in and did all that with one plane pass. I'm sure Marcello will talk about that a little bit. So suddenly we know that the populations were gigantic, right? Not just larger than we thought earlier. Basically, since the 19th century, every couple of decades, we've realized the Maya population is larger than we thought before. It's been a sea change, basically, in the last 10 years to realize just how big they were. Population of millions of people in that central area. And when we go from that to a complete abandonment of all of those centers, jungle, then we realize how gigantic the change was, right? It's not a somewhat smallish population building skyscrapers and deciding, let's not build those anymore and let's try something else. Something must have happened to chase all of those people out of that area. And that's the kind of really remarkable story of that period of time. And as Marcello said, it's that area still has not recovered, as we would say, from a particular point of view, right? That it certainly doesn't have anything like those populations now. It might be a long time before there are millions of people living in the central Maya area again. There certainly aren't now. Yeah.
I think that there needs to be a name for the immutable law of the universe, that the more that you look for something, the more that you're going to find. I don't know if that's a law yet, but there has, is there a name for that?
No, but it's fascinating how this plays out in all.
There's a law named after someone. Yeah.
Yeah. We could make one right now if we want to. It plays out in science so much too, just across the disciplines. It's fascinating because we have a tendency to look at people who had ideas that we no longer agree with and think, well, they're just kind of primitive, like early scientist people. And they're really just trying to interpret the evidence to the best of their ability too. And that's what's so funny is that we tend to think of ourselves in modern times as having all of the evidence sometimes, when we listen to what's the contemporary theory of X in any discipline, it's like, well, we're undoubtedly missing pieces of the story too. And we have to always keep that humility, I think, or we run the risk of calcifying and making something sort of tyrannical out of science where it's just stuck in the mud and people hang on to these ideas, their theories before they actually, are willing to go and look for new pieces to it.
So that's interesting. Were there people in the field prior to the most recent LiDAR discovery who were insisting that the populations were way larger than current estimates and had been kind of dismissed? Or was everybody kind of in agreement? What was the train? I won't lead the witness too much.
No. So I would say that the overall approach to questions of demography was that we could not be sure one way or another, right? There were people who suspected that populations may be higher or lower than what might be just generally interpreted at any given moment, right? There was always variation in terms of that opinion. From one of the earliest estimates for populations for this region was deemed incredibly high, right, by subsequent scholars. And then with LiDAR data, it actually ended up being not as far-fetched as a number as possible, but not necessarily because the individual 100 years ago had the data to suggest it, right? There was an extrapolation based on a very small amount of data. So really, one of the issues that we're looking at is that data collection in this region is difficult, whether it's from hieroglyphic writing or whether it's about settlements or whether it's about large monumental buildings and so forth. It is a complicated, difficult, and arduous process, and slow if done properly. That has taken the century or more, if you will, to collect, to even begin to talk about some of these questions, right? And we're looking at a region that isn't visible to the naked eye, to a satellite, if you will, to the naked eye of a satellite, right? It's not an open space. It is a relatively close, and even if it's not covered in forest, it's still a very complicated and vegetation-rich environment. So the research that we've conducted and the data that we've collected has come in fits and starts and spurts that allow us to have a best case scenario at any given moment. So what Marc was suggesting, talking about initially, we had even 200 years ago, there were many monuments that were recovered, but we didn't really understand what the hieroglyphic text on them said, except for certain things that related to dates, right? So we had this highly precise piece of information, which was their dating and their dates about certain things, but we really couldn't understand what they were talking about within those dates, right? So we had this kind of very uneven set of information. It wasn't a slow growing nuance that we really understood. Oh, they, like those funny movies that say, 300 years ago, war, Wednesday afternoon, right? But they don't give any other context. They just say Wednesday afternoon. It's that kind of thing. We had that level of detail, but we couldn't really put together what was going on Wednesday afternoon and which Wednesday, right? In of the millions of Wednesdays that have happened in the past, right? So we were struggling with that kind of balance, and so theories that are trying to explain an entire society, an entire kind of phenomenon that lasted without really necessarily knowing how far in the past it goes or why it ended, of course, are going to have growing pains, right? So the demographic question was, I think, and I've always felt that the demographic question, going back specifically to what you're asking, is one of the most important questions to ask. It might not be the most interesting or exciting, right? But if I'm telling you a story about some ancient city and about what's happened there, and I tell you that it had 300 people, and then I tell you about another city and I say, oh, this one has 300,000 people, right? In your mind, you're constructing completely different scenarios about how that city might have been like living in that past. It's a question of scale. So population really is not about a number, right? Which unfortunately is how people think about it. Population is more a question of scale of people and what that means with regards to pragmatic questions of organization, communication, agriculture, production, and so forth, right? So it's kind of like the base of discussing a series of other questions that are perhaps more interesting and more important, but you can't really advance without having a strong sense of that demographic base, right? And how it might change over time. And that's going to be another issue that we're going to be arguing for a long time about how population levels might have varied over time, which is something that we aren't really prepared to answer yet in any way. So certainly the way I look at it is, well, it might seem like a silly, simple thing to like, oh, who cares about? I'm not interested in that. Well, actually, every model, every political system, every economic system, every sort of social system modifies and takes its shape and is organized in a certain way based upon simply the number of people that are included in that system, right? And that's, I think, the scale of the number of people that are in that system, and that, I think, is why it's such an important point. So yes, there's been a kind of a constant variation. People thinking that there were, let's say, to give numbers, but less than 1 million, and then those who thought there were 25 million, right? So that's the range that we've been working with, the most extreme positions, of course, and over time, as we hoped with better and better data, that range of possible population scales has narrowed, right? And There will be those, however, who believe that that's not, that the ranges that we recently suggested in an article are still too high. And there are those who might believe that it's still too low. So that will never resolve itself until we finally sort of get enough data for the whole region. But I think now that disagreement, and perhaps Marc, you might, if you disagree, let me know. But I think that the range of disagreement has narrowed, which is already a really good thing to see, because that means that we're all talking about roughly the same kind of demographic phenomenon.
No, absolutely agreed. I mean, so I think that nobody would dispute anymore that there are millions. And then the real question is just, are we talking about 10 million in the central area? Or are we talking about still tens of millions if we consider everything else? And that's a huge contribution, because it goes hand in hand with what we've learned from the hieroglyphic decipherment, a stronger and stronger understanding of the language that was recorded in hieroglyphic inscriptions on the basis of a better understanding of the modern Mayan languages and how they're connected in greater or lesser degrees to it. What it does for us is two wonderful things, right? If we just take one thing that comes from the hieroglyphs and the languages cooperating now with the new data from archaeology, right? So rather than being completely different disciplines doing different things, we're talking to each other and collaborating. And so if we understand that there were 10 million or more inhabitants in this central area, or let's just say millions, because I think everybody, that would be consensual at this point, right? And if we add to that the fact that they all stopped writing, in the early 9th century, the cities were abandoned, then we have to ask the question, what happened to those millions of people? Now, if those millions of people had all fled to the shores and to the river areas at the sort of, edges, say, of what we consider the classic Maya area, and they'd all been taken in and they'd all still continued to have happy lives after they abandoned these cities, you would have millions of people being absorbed in different parts of the Maya area, north, east, west, and south, who then would be presumed to have had an impact, right? The language that we find written in hieroglyphic inscriptions would presumably have transferred to those other peoples, because you can't take in millions of your necessary neighbors without them having some impact on that. And yet we don't find that. We don't find that this language continues. The words for their gods, the words for some of their social institutions, various titles that are recorded in hieroglyphic inscriptions, those just end. And that really suggests that this change isn't just, people voting with their feet and leaving the cities behind, but that there might be one of the most profound, devastating demographic collapses that we've documented anywhere in the world, that millions of people actually did die. It's undoubtedly the case that thousands, maybe even tens of thousands, might have gone on and lived through this collapse, but most of them almost certainly did not. And that's a striking thing to discover. It makes the lesson that we might be able to learn from what happened, what the trajectories were, what might have gone wrong, that much more relevant, right? Than if it was simply the culture deciding, now it's time to end this cycle and move on to lower settlement density and move away from the cities. This was something
it takes a pretty serious break to cause, right? It takes a pretty serious break to have a lingual bifurcation like that, for populations to start making up new words for things, or at least to separate out to the degree that they're speaking in different tongues. Like that either usually requires a geographic barrier, or the people have to really hate each other enough to not hang out, right?
Oh, you're saying like the people in the coastal areas that would absorb would be culturally and socially isolated on purpose?
Yeah, I wonder if that social distinction started before the collapse, if there was some sort of polarization already going on where people were... I just wonder what circumstances could lead people to be speaking different variations of a language,
Is it different variations of a language or different languages?
I mean, there's 30 different Mayan languages spoken today, and we know a lot about their history. If we can compare them, we can reconstruct them, in the same way that you can take Portuguese and Latin, and Portuguese and Italian and French, and reconstruct that they all came from a Latin, a kind of regional Latin, right, of the late Roman Empire. And we can see that, in fact, there must have been multiple different Mayan languages spoken back in classic times at the height of this civilization. It wasn't that everybody that we call Maya today are descended from that group, right? There were in fact different groups on different trajectories that go back well before this period in time. Our best guess is something like, 3,000 or 4,000 BC, you had one Mayan language. So there was already a lot of diversification, different Mayan language that weren't mutually intelligible spoken at this time. So the people that are writing are one sort of part of this big family tree, if that makes sense. And what we have to argue then is that if there are, several million of these people and their civilization collapses and those that can get out and get to somewhere else do, there can't have been enough of them that were successful that they swamped the people that were taking them in. In other words, if there were really millions and then they, introduced themselves into, say, the highlands, right, where we now today find Quiche Maya and Kekchi and Cachiquel and others, there can't have been enough of them that suddenly, everybody was speaking that language, and so it made sense for all of them to take it on board. It must have been communities of, 1,000 people or more taking in 100 here or there, right? Maybe at most, right? And so that would explain why we don't see that continuity in that way. And there are parallels. Probably one of the best ones is the Bronze Age collapse in the Aegean and the Mediterranean, where what we can read in Linear B inscriptions from Mycenae and from Crete are different sets of titles, different political institutions and gods that then after the Greek Dark Ages don't pick up again when we see them writing in the Phoenician borrowed alphabet, in the 7th century BC, right? So there's a rupture between, say, 1200 BC and 700 BC of 500 years. And there's brand new Greeks that come on the scene with very, very different sets of social institutions, as if most of the people that participated in that Bronze Age civilization are no longer around or calling the shots at the very, very least, if that makes sense.
One thing to keep in mind, and we were actually just talking about it right before we came on, Mark and I is that we're sort of limited sometimes by the term Maya that we used as a kind of a catch-all category for this entire area and all the people within it. The word Maya, at least when it was applied to ancient people, was meant to be a temporary term until we could, with further research, be able to distinguish the various Maya groups that existed in the past, right? And it was just meant to be an umbrella term until we had this kind of more highly resolved data. When we look at the modern landscape, Maya groups today are known as Quiche or Cachiquel or Yucatec and so forth. There's a large group of them, right? It's sort of an umbrella term. Maya might be, something similar, European, something just that gets a whole group of people to be in this region that share a certain history and a certain set of traditions and cultures, but are different enough from one another that they themselves don't necessarily recognize their own similarity at first blush, right? Mm. Now, modern day Maya groups are beginning to understand that there is a political advantage and a valence to being understood as Maya generally. And so that's becoming more and more a term that has currency. But 50 to 100 years ago, or even 1,000 years ago, that term would only have been applied to certain groups of people and not all. So what we're looking at is this phenomenon in what we call the lowland Maya area, right, which is this sort of tropical environment, might very well have been a limited group, a particular Maya group with a certain language and certain traditions that did not easily or necessarily translate to their neighboring groups. And perhaps there's plenty of examples of groups, neighboring groups, kind of critiquing one another in other contexts, saying, well, they live this way, we don't want to live that way, we're different from them, right? And oftentimes it results in conflict of one kind or another, right? Which we usually interpret as sort of imperial expansion and so forth. But it's not as if ancient groups did not recognize their own differences and want to maintain those differences for whatever reason. So the fact that in what we're picking up, now that we have enough data to be able to compare, let's say, the political language and the political system and how it was expressed in northern Yucatan, right, in the 1200s. Compare that with how it was expressed by the classic Maya in the 700s or 600s, and see that there's this kind of few shared terms and so forth that lets us know, yes, going to maybe your original question about a system of government, right, or language of government, there might have been a different way of seeing how politics and how society worked in potentially related to different cultural groups within the Maya world, but also perhaps learning from history, from their own history, and saying this is not to be repeated one way or another, for whatever reason, right? Or not to be emulated. Right?
Can I just really clarify something? Is it possible? I just want to understand something. Before, this is really fascinating to me, but do we assume that each one of these new pockets of Maya, that the different tribes that have come up, is that the right word, tribe? These different groups, these ethnic, cultural, linguistic groups that exist today, did they arrive from, is the theory that they arrive from different centers each, or that they are somehow subcultures within the same centers? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's
Are they, is it like Brooklyn, or is it like, Austin, Texas? I don't know. I can't think of a good one. I'm sorry.
Most of the Maya groups that are, extant today, millions of speakers, right, are not groups that we can actually trace to any of the cities of the classic Maya civilization. They're people that are descendants of people that have always been where they are right now. But as I say, we have this hugely depopulated central area where most of these great cities were. We don't have continuity there. We have this extremely abrupt discontinuity, right? In the 9th century, it ends, people either die or they leave, right? And what we have is, in the highlands of Guatemala, people that have been there for time immemorial, Maya groups that have been there going all the way back to their common ancestors. In fact, their ancestors were there probably in the highlands at the time that these great cities were being built in the lowlands, right? And the same is true for people in the far north and in the highlands of Chiapas on the sort of far western part, right, of the Maya area. And even a lot of continuity in, say, Belize. We have these surface rivers, the droughts that probably were a part of the reason for the story of the collapse, right, didn't affect the people living on rivers in Belize. So you have the direct descendants of those people that were there living on those rivers at that time as well. So it's a pretty complex story. Marcello is absolutely right that we're in a bit of a linguistic trap because scholars took the name of one group of Maya speakers. Here I'm in the same boat. One group of people living in the far north of the Yucatan do call themselves Maya, and probably always did. But at the time that these great cities were reared, nobody in those cities used the word Maya. We've never found it in an inscription. They probably didn't even think of themselves as Maya. The Maya were this group living far off of the north at a city called Mayapan, which actually seems to have been its real name. The people at Tikal called themselves Mutul. The people at the great city of Calakmul called themselves Kanul. The people at the great city of Palenque in Chiapas called themselves Bakel, right? And so on. And they identify themselves as coming from their city-state. So if we think of classical Greece, you have Athenians, you have Spartans, right? They're at the center of, dense networks of allies and clients that went to war with one another. At the far distant remove, they had a concept of themselves as Hellenes, right? Speaking the same language. We don't even know if the Maya of the classic period had that kind of overarching sense. They seem to have been very, very separate, from one another in these warring city-states and these models. And so this is one of many linguistic traps, is when we say there was a Maya collapse, but there is still Maya today, right? That's partly because we're calling them all Maya because they all share this linguistic relationship, right? But it might be accurate to say that many of the people that built classic Maya civilization have left no descendants, right? What we have is their relatives, closer and more distant, that are still going on in different ways. And some of them undoubtedly have left descendants, but only by virtue of having left that area and being taken in by other groups, and probably their children and their children's children are now speaking different languages and have been absorbed by different cultures that we all call Maya as a term of increasing inconvenience, actually. It was once a real term of convenience that's become a little bit confusing. Yeah.
Were the city centers... I'm sorry.
No. I was going to say that the term Maya is such an overgeneralization that it's becoming complicated.
Yeah, more and more inconvenient as we learn more. Yeah.
One point to keep in mind about all this, going back to the notion of demographic collapse and so forth, is that the area that where we find all of these large cities that collapse around the 8th and 9th and 10th centuries was re-inhabited later on. And in large part, it was re-inhabited by Maya groups descending to the region, I think of it north-south, but coming to the region from the north from what we call the Yucatan, the northern part, the northern Yucatan, settling that region because they were escaping the colonial forces that had arrived in the 1500s. The famous Lacandon Maya that were thought to be the one of the few groups that were never Christianized and rarely contacted by Spaniards, were groups of people that had escaped from colonial incursions into Yucatan into an area that was effectively empty, and they were therefore isolated for several centuries beyond, after the first contact with Europeans. There was a city state. The last independent Maya city state was established in the central part of this region, right where the city of Flores in Guatemala is, essentially, because it was a place where the Spaniards had a tough time getting to, right? So even this region that was the center of this flourishing society for centuries, by the time the Spaniards arrived, was considered a place to escape to, because nothing was there, right? So just even how that might have played into the understanding of the way the Maya saw their own world. This was a place that was considered likely a place where people had lived before. Not that they didn't necessarily know that they were ignorant of that, but not in a way that was a sense of continuity. In fact, most of the people today who are of Maya descent or of indigenous descent in these regions that are central part are descendants of these much later migrations, right?
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. The Lacandon, probably not earlier than 1700 would they have entered into this area, because the language is still mutually intelligible with Yucatec from the north. Where Marcello works in northern Guatemala, there are Kekchi Maya speakers, and we know that they came to the north from the south. And again, so long after the collapse, when the area came back and was something that could sustain farming and things like that, again, people entered into this, trackless jungle, but saw ruins everywhere, right? And it's pretty remarkable, of course, that this group, the Lacandon from the north and the Kekchi from the south, they're not descendants of the people that built these cities. They're from other Maya groups. Again, you can see the inconvenience of the label. Right, they're from, distantly related cultures that came back into these areas and has now adopted them as new homes, of course, right? But that wasn't always known, of course. So all the early ethnographies and inscriptions of these Lacandon and Chiapas describe them as, they're very often described in very exoticized and essentialized terms as the lost Maya,
the last Maya.
Jungles. Right. We can learn about what the Maya once believed and did by looking at them, without recognizing that they've been there only for 200 years longer than, say, the modern.
One book. Remember, Mark, one book was titled "The Last Lords of Palenque."
The Last Lords of Palenque, absolutely.
Because these Lacandon Maya were found in the general region of the classic Maya site of Palenque, and because of their isolation, they were assumed to have been descendants of that region, of the people who had lived in that region since time immemorial, which is not the case at all.
Is there a sense that the cities had a role in moderating interactions between these different groups, or were the cities just doing their own thing while the people around them were doing their own thing?
It's probably a mixture of both. I mean, the largest cities were real cosmopolitan centers in a lot of ways. We find some good pieces of evidence that people speaking different languages are present at them. The formal writing was done in one specific Mayan language, which we regard as being like a prestige language that cut across a lot of these local variants. Think of Latin in the High Middle Ages, right? If you were, Italian, I almost said that wouldn't be wrong, but I'm thinking more of like Irish monks in the British Isles, or Anglo-Saxon monks, or Germans, right, on the continent. They're all writing in Latin, even though they're speaking very, very different, European languages, right? So writing went along with this language. So you had this prestige language that all of the kings and the courts could presumably speak and certainly wrote in, so they could communicate with one another, even though they were largely governing populations that were speaking different vernaculars, right, of closely related or more distantly related languages. So yeah, to some extent, they mediated relationships, right, among different groups. But as I was mentioning, you have these highland Maya populations. At the time that all this is going on in the lowlands, they're still doing their own thing, speaking their own languages. They're not living in giant cities. They're not writing, right? So there was a lot of Maya groups that didn't buy in to whatever was going on in the lowlands. So what collapsed there was one particular manifestation of, civilization in this part of the world. And not every group that today calls themselves Maya is descended from that tradition or has ancestors that were in that part of the tradition, if that makes sense.
Got it.
Archaeologically, in the last 20 or 30 years, one of the more interesting kind of technological advances has been the ability to analyze bones and teeth for particular chemical signatures that have allowed us to determine whether someone died in the place where they were born. And this has really been a fascinating new kind of hard evidence, right? It's the amount of strontium that is in your teeth and in your bones, right? So the theory goes that when you're born, you drink the local water, the strontium levels that are naturally available in that environment are become part of your body, and your body reflects that amount of strontium. As your teeth are growing, they will grow with those strontium levels in your teeth. But your teeth stop growing at a certain point. And if you're me, you start losing your teeth way too early. But anyway, that's a side point. But you have a certain kind of age range in which your teeth are forming. After which, it doesn't really matter where you move and where you live in, or how much strontium there is in the groundwater, or how much or how little. That level of strontium that are embedded in your teeth is not going to change. However, your bones are replaced. The material of your bones are replaced organically every 7 or so years, say a decade for simplistic terms. And so your bones strontium levels will reflect over a period of time the strontium levels in the area where you've lived. Right. So when someone dies and we have recover their skeleton that is in good enough state, we can compare the strontium levels of their bones to the strontium levels of their teeth, assuming we are able to get those pieces of data, and say, oh, look, where the strontium levels are different. In other words, they're not where they died, not where they were born, or vice versa, right?
Or the environment changed,
to me
right?
is really, sorry?
Or the environment changed, right? Because you could imagine a situation where the strontium in the water changed because of like aquifer shifts, right?
That's unlikely. Those are really base level kinds of chemical signatures that have very little to do with. That's why it's not, let's say, carbon or nitrogen. These particular elements that are much more sensitive to those kinds of changes. Strontium is sort of a heavier element. So it's really just what's available in things like groundwater and the food that you eat, the drink water, also, especially if it's game and so on.
How did we? Sorry, hold on one second. Before we move on from this, because what are the studies that establish the constancy of strontium in something like groundwater?
Something like fauna, for the most part, right? Looking
exactly
bones of, say, mice and other little rodents and things like that, recovered archaeologically, even paleontologically, and then in the modern era, they have a baseline that lets us believe that, say, all of the mice captured in very, very different time periods at Copan in Honduras have the same basic strontium signature. And so that's how we assume that hasn't
internal
changed. And of course, oxygen and nitrogen do shift. Right. And so those are less useful for that, although they are useful for things like type of foods you're eating, right? And diet and
So the issue is independent of the actual base levels to be able to say, oh, this person comes from this area or this other area, which requires that kind of source data, which are usually understood to be animals that don't have a huge range, right? These are not migratory animals that will, over their lifespan, cross different regions, but they are relatively small. Therefore, rodents and so forth are a perfect kind of animal for that. Those levels are compared. And they vary according to whether the region is volcanic, whether the region is karstic, whether the region is coastal, and so on and so forth, because strontium has different levels that occur naturally in these different environments. So that kind of analysis has really opened up a new dimension for our study, from not just demographic levels, but also what are people moving around. Right? And of course, this was initially applied to elites, nobles and so forth, and we found that yes, in fact, there were nobles that were that were foreign, and there were nobles that were local, and there was very interesting questions politically about foreigners coming in, intermarrying with local lineages and so forth. But we were also quite surprised to find that what we would understand as the regular population, non-elite population, was also quite mobile. Isn't exactly the word I want to use, but there was a lot of movement of people throughout the region. And the movement of these people were likely mediated in one way or another by these cities, right? By the fact that they were going from one region with a certain capital city to another, and they were entering into another realm with other groups of people. Whether that was because of marriage, or we're
trying to get out of New York and get to Oregon instead.
Yeah, exactly. Trade and so forth. I don't know if you all stayed in New York long enough, but probably, and when you moved, but probably your bones are beginning to be organized.
Organized.
We've lived in a lot of different places. The archaeologists are going to be totally confused.
Well, that's right. That might be right.
It's kind of fascinating now to just know how much people did travel around.
Yeah,
we've known for a little while. There's this one massive city that you've undoubtedly heard of in central Mexico, stone's throw, from Mexico City, which is called Teotihuacan. It's a
we've been there a couple times.
Yeah, we don't know what they called it themselves anciently, but it was a massive, gigantic, city, and it was as thoroughly cosmopolitan as a city like New York. One of the ways we know that is that the different apartment compounds, they even had like the equivalent of apartments, right? As compared to household groups there, huge populations. And some of them have murals on the walls with literate Maya writing on them. We found no less than 3 separate apartment compounds where they were writing in Mayan there, using Mayan hieroglyphs in the middle of the 6th century, early 6th century. And there's other compounds where they were writing Zapotec, hieroglyphic writing from Oaxaca. And there's a local writing system which scholars are starting to unravel, right? So there's at least 3, there's solid evidence in the form of literacy writing, but there's at least 3 completely different linguistic and literate groups that are all mingling there, which gives us a sense of where the commonalities we see in Mesoamerican civilization probably came from, right? So Teotihuacan was a vast crucible of the mixing of different cultures, and large cities like Tikal and Calakmul in the Maya lowlands were the local, slightly smaller, but nonetheless, regionally significant centers where you would have had some culture mixing, people buying in to widely shared new ideas, and that would be how culture, developed and altered over time, over hundreds of years in that region.
And we even have evidence that people from Teotihuacan were living in the Maya region.
Yeah, so it was the other way around as well. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
So there was if there was that level of communication that was essentially from Mexico City to Guatemala, right, in terms of distance, you certainly would expect there to be a lot of intra-regional movement between and amongst these various cities.
It's kind of a blast from the past in some ways, because when the field of cultural anthropology, comparative anthropology was starting to get going in the US, right, in the Americas, in the 1920s, you had scholars that were very fascinated by what they called culture areas, right? And a lot of this is still hanging out. When we talk about Mesoamerica, as anthropologists or archaeologists, we're not just talking about a geographical label. We're talking about these widely shared items of culture and belief that were first notated and listed way back in the 20s. So here we are 100 years later, and these widely shared things like the ball game, right? And building pyramids with, causeways and big platforms, and having a calendar, having hieroglyphic writing, right? Having a pantheon of deities that fulfilled certain kind of customs. We never really understood why it was that all of these people shared it, right? And also why it wasn't shared widely north of Mesoamerica or south of it. But now we're actually starting to be able to document how it was that these widely shared ideas got spread. So Teotihuacan came up with some of them, and people were exposed to them and brought the ones that they enjoyed back. And people at Tikal probably innovated some things, Calakmul others. People came to the periodic markets and were exposed to them. So archaeology, along with the epigraphy and the decipherment and the study of the languages, has started to show us how Mesoamerica came to be created, right? We sort of regarded it as just a thing. But we can actually see it develop over time, from a lot of regional differences early on to a lot of similarity and shared ideas.
I think that's what's so frightening, because you look at something like that and it feels like it should have continued. it feels like by the time that somebody rolled around in the 1400s, it should have been resilient enough and strong enough, given the number of people that were culturally connected, to withstand whatever attack came from outside, just in terms of sheer numbers, right? Because you have a small number of invading, conquistadors or whatever showing up, but you have a huge base of population that should be protective against that. But because they collapsed, or
the state collapsed, essentially, it seems like, right?
And that's so scary, right? Because you're like, okay, so what happened in the 9th century that made it so that by the time that the 1400s rolled around, this wasn't a sufficiently resilient group or a sufficiently resilient state that could have defended against that?
I think state is part of the answer, right? I'm sorry, Marcello.
No,
you were going to say the
I was
same
going to say
thing.
there are sort of two questions here, which is the issue of a concerted or coordinated response to any kind of outside threat, in general, whether it's within Mesoamerica, and then what actually happened as a result of contact with Europeans, which is a completely different set of factors, that involves, the contact of human groups that had been out of contact with one another for tens of thousands of years, and the consequent issues that result from that, right? Which is, of course, disease, right? And so, the reason why the conquest occurred the way it did, and how it kind of played out over the first 100 years, has a lot more to do, in my estimation anyway, with the contact with diseases that were brought from Europe into the Americas that were not endemic here.
Do you know anything? Have you read Charles Mann's work?
Yeah.
What do you think of his? He's actually coming on the podcast like next week or 2 weeks from now. And so, what do you guys think about?
And he basically sets up that thesis that disease radically altered the demographic landscape before the arrival of all the technological forces that we usually attribute to.
Like, he places the epidemic basically at the point of arrival rather than after the point of arrival. Like, by the time that Columbus got here, Mann proposes that there had been a hypervirulent strain. I think that he came down on it being like an airborne version of hepatitis that swept from like an isolated point of contact in New England throughout all of the Americas down, I think, into Central America as well.
Such that the basic premise is what we all grew up on, that there's these sort of primitive tribes inhabiting the land, was an artifact of observing the leftovers of a very catastrophic apocalypse scenario. It's like if you just killed off 95% of America right now, you'd be left with a bunch of crazy rednecks in the woods. And that's kind of why we ended up with this myth of the, noble savage and all this.
There's undoubtedly places where that is true, right? But of course, North America, Middle America, and South America are huge continents with very, very highly varied, populations and cultures and continuities of settlement, right? So we know, of course, from Hernan de Soto and other descriptions of vast populated Mississippi, valley cities and centers, right? So it can't be the case that there was a, demographic collapse due to disease and contact prior to that. But certainly as a result of de Soto and his men passing through that area, and Coronado passing through the Southwest in the United States, that would have been the time of introduction. It's hard to believe that any contact in New England, right, in the early 17th century could have had any impact on what Cortez found, right, or Grijalva or earlier groups in the 16th century, far to the south. So there were time periods, I think, where, Cortez did see a more or less pristine example of a pre-Columbian situation in the Maya area, right? But what he saw was something that was a continuity in other respects, right? Even during the height of classic Maya civilization in the 9th century, you had city-states that were at war with one another. And there was never a single unifying, say, Maya empire. So even let's suppose that if, Spanish or Old World people had come to the Maya area at the height of Maya civilization, they probably wouldn't have encountered a coordinated response either. they might have also been successful in playing one group against another group by inflaming old animosities, right? The British model in India, right? The Cortez's model for the Aztecs, having the Tlaxcalans join him and fight against the Aztecs, right? So the divide and conquer strategy likely still would have worked. But even before it had to completely pay off, as Marcello's saying, I think there's no doubt that it was those moments of contact that then spread smallpox and other strains, because that's when we see this huge, 90% loss of population in those early years after those contacts, right?
Is one of the difficulties in being able to figure out what happened in the 9th century the fact that most of the Mayan hieroglyph writing that we have from these state-produced edifices is literally carved in stone rather than being something that's available to, say, the average person living in their apartment who's journaling about what's happening?
Mm-hmm. That's part of it, undoubtedly. I mean, because we don't have a good, year by year, even decade by decade account of what happened in the wake of collapse, right? We just see it end. So obviously, nobody is taking a moment in the midst of whatever is happening to, erect a monument and carve on it. Oh my goodness, right? And the whole point of putting up a monument is that it, bolsters the local regime. It presents a certain face. So the last thing we're really going to see is a nuts and bolts account, right? Of what's going on. But that's not to say that we see nothing, because we see some trends in it, including, foreign groups coming in from the West, the occasional records of things like droughts that just weren't recorded during the hundreds of years prior, that indicate there are some kind of climatic issues that are playing a role, and maybe opportunistic foreigners coming in because there are some troubles, and of course it's not unicausal, right? So we think that a big part of it is, multiple different things all reaching ahead at a similar time. If there are millions of people and they're really depending on the carrying capacity of the land and the climate going just as it is, all you need is a couple of localized disasters, a really bad drought, maybe a particularly bad hurricane destroying all of the crops of southern Belize, that the whole thing, sort of jettisons into chaos. And then, of course, you'll have localized warfare. You'll have people taking advantage and coming in from the outside. So
the more a
something like that.
The more a system is interrelated, right? The more any one area of that system failing or faltering will have the more that one area will have an impact on the rest of it. I would also point out that the media that we have, as you say, think of trying to reconstruct the history of the United States by only looking at what is written on stone monuments in the big cities, right? Walking through the rubble of DC, let's say 2,000 years from now, and trying to reconstruct the history of the United States based upon just what is engraved in stone, right? We all know that would be a very laconic history, right? A very kind of quick and not very detailed, and of course one that is highly filtered and one-sided, right? Based upon why things become monuments and when they do. And we had a recent spate of discussions in the United States about what monuments we should still have up and what monuments we should take down. These things get then further edited, such that these are no longer stories that we want to tell ourselves about ourselves, and they must be taken down, destroyed, and removed. The Maya did this as well. We have lots of evidence of monuments being destroyed and taken down and thrown in effectively the architectural fill of a building to be hidden away, right? Not to be thought of anymore, taken out of sight. We as archaeologists dig those things up and we add them to the historical canon, but it's that we're slowly reconstructing. But it is interesting to note that this was a kind of editing that the Maya themselves did, even in this highly already curated set of texts, of stories that they wanted to tell. So it is a challenge, right? And yes, if we could get diaries, or if we had the access to those kinds of writings, even any kind of book. We have a few examples that survived almost miraculously.
And
they
all of
are
them from 1000 AD or later.
from much later, but they are scintillating windows into what could be a much more complicated set of information that we would be able to use to explain what's going on. That unfortunately is missing, right? And that's something that is, I think, why every little bit of information that we get is important, because it's just scraps here and scraps there. Now, one thing to keep in mind as we talk about all of this, we are, as a group of scholars, trying to recreate, trying to recover and re-record, if you will, the historical events and so forth as written on these monuments. But what we create is while we try to create a single, if you will, narrative of many different voices, working in tandem or working separately and so forth, and trying to say, okay, this is the history, the classic Maya history. All of these texts that we have are scraps of information that weren't necessarily made to fit into a large historical narrative. We are creating that narrative as a function of what these texts might say. So they're not giving us history per se. A ruler in one city might be celebrating a battle, and telling us, or telling the world, I had a battle, and all of these captives were brought in front of me, right? It brought before me. And look at me, I'm great. We then say, oh, that battle occurred in this decade, and we know that this king from some other text is an ally of this other king, and we know that that other king had a battle with so and so, and then so we create all of these connections and try to make intent and a kind of a fluid and historical narrative about why these battles occurred. None of that, or very little of that, is explicit in the text themselves, right? They are announcements of events or of activities or ceremonies and so forth, without any kind of historical or historiographic narrative attached to them. And so that's where we can often perhaps over and maybe sometimes even under-interpret them, right? And not wish to see connections when the connections are there, or sometimes oversee connections that we may be making more.
Yeah, one thing we're really missing is anything like what the classical civilizations of Greece and Rome give us, which is actual historians.
That's right.
We think about people like Herodotus, right? Who actually, making histories of the Greco-Persian Wars and balancing different accounts and engaging on what we would call historiography in the ancient world already, talking to sources both living and dead by looking at literature about what happened between Greece and Persia. But we don't have any classic Maya historians in that sense. Everything we're getting is curated history that a king has allowed his scribe or group of scribes to present about what's happened in the past 5 years or the last 20 years at the most. When a monument goes up to celebrate a particular, time period coming to an end, and what were sort of the big things that happened back then. But nobody is stepping away and saying, okay, here's what different city-states are saying. We have no classic Maya historians in that sense. And we have a much more restricted literacy than we think that any place in Greece or Rome had. Probably 1% to 2% of the population at any time could read or write this system, which is a very, very complex writing system, one of the most complex writing systems that any humans ever invented. So it costs years of effort to learn it, presumably even as a speaker in the ancient world, analogous to Japanese writing today, very, very complex.
We get a few inklings of what would be a fascinating narrative when we get, let's say, going back to the very first thing we were talking about with Copan and Quirigua, that battle between the 13th ruler of Copan that we were discussing earlier and the nearby city that defeated him. It's one of these few cases, and there are a few of them, they're not that many. There are a few cases where we have the same event being discussed by two different city-states, right? And so you get a kind of a sort of an idea of how different groups might have seen the exact same event, rather than it being narrated by one person who won, usually, right? Yeah. And that's the only story that we get. In the case of these two cities, there's the losing side and how they narrate their own history and relate that particular event and put that event in their history, versus the victor and what they do relative to this particular event. And it's kind of interesting, right? The city-state that loses tends to elide over this particular event, and they're quite how do I put it? They're very diplomatic about, and then right, and then the ruler died, right? Let's move on, right? Like that's it's the whole sense of the narrative of their own history says, yeah, this person died. Let's not dwell on this particular person. Whereas at the other side, that one, they can't stop talking about this event, right? They commemorate a series of monuments talking about it, and then even decades later, they're building monuments to something else, and they recall, by the way, this happened 34 years after that victory. Remember that victory? So there's this kind of pumping up of the local dynasty in a way over this one event, while the other one seems to be doing everything in its power to try to forget it, right? And so this is, you can see, it would have been fascinating to have someone who could have collected all of these stories and written a kind of narrative in their own world about all of this, because what we get are these official stories, but sometimes they don't coincide, or it's rare that we get sort of conflicting. What we get are this different, maybe a slightly different perspectives on the same event, which I think is always interesting.
Are there oral traditions or song or poetry or some other place to explore the potential for filling in those missing pieces?
No, that's a fascinating question. And this gets right back to the question of, the Maya and the kind of trap of that etymological label. So we have a lot of detailed ethno-historical records that go all the way back to the Spanish arrival in the 16th century. We have myths and legends and even histories that were gathered then. Once the Maya from very different groups in different parts of the peninsula learned to write the Roman alphabet, they were taught Latin or they were taught Spanish in local missionary schools. They naturally immediately adopted it to write, their own Maya languages, and they recorded myths and histories and legends. But none of them comport with anything like what we see in Maya hieroglyphic writing. There's a really, really good indication that there's no historical memory of these kings or these kingdoms or these places that lived in any of the people that fled that region and joined other groups. Instead, what we get for the few times that in any of these sources people talk of, say, the ruins, nobody says this was once a great city and, Maya people once lived here and they were organized into kingdoms and they fought wars with this other city. Nothing like that.
But
in
that's
all
a huge,
cases where
that's
there's
a huge gap of time, right? So like if we're talking
no,
about the
absolutely.
cities ending
no doubt
in the
about
9th
it.
century.
But in this case, there's really, really good evidence of a disruption, though, in that it's always giants who built them, or dwarves, or gods, or supernatural beings. No sense that it was the immediate ancestors of any group that were responsible for these cities. And you're right, it's a huge group. It's from the 9th century until we first find any of this stuff recorded, which is 1600, right? So we are talking about a gap of 600 years.
And yet there are elements within these texts from the 16th century and 17th centuries and so forth, like this famous book that we know as the Popol Vuh, right? Which is a book written by a certain group of Maya in the highlands to make a claim about lands and so forth to the Spanish crown, and in it they included not only their own local histories, but also what is understood as their creation story, right? And this is deep time, right? This is not about anything historical about their particular group. This is understood to be something that is kind of a creation myth that goes back to the beginning of time, to the creation of humans, right? So it's sort of like a Genesis story, as it were. And what we do see is that elements of that story are shared across the Maya world, as well as with the group, the Maya, the classic Maya of the lowland of the lowland region, in iconography from that time period, in murals and so forth. So while there isn't a historical memory of this particular group or any groups in modern day in the modern day world that remember this historical period, they did share ideas, beliefs, creation myths and so forth from across this entire region, right? So there's this very interesting, almost omission, if you will, of this particular the historical time period, right? The near time, as it were, rather than deep time, and that's very interesting. I think it sort of tells us that what Mark was saying earlier about a disruption is important to keep in mind. It was something that really just did not translate beyond the 900 AD for the rest of the Maya groups in the region and in later time.
It is remarkable how oral transmission, right, of belief definitely privileges religion, right, and mythology over anything like history or political history. So we have the Bronze Age collapse and the loss of the great Mycenaean kingdoms and the Minoans, right, living on Crete. But we know that those people worshipped Zeus and Athena and deities. Those continued, but there's no mention of the individual names in any of the oral histories, if you will, of the later Greek peoples. Those all had to be recovered from early writing. Yeah,
and that kind of speaks to a big break in terms of information transmission in the culture itself, right? Where you imagine that, okay, so there is the king, there's a court, and everybody in that court probably is paying close attention to the king and all of his struggles with the next city-state over. But if you're a peasant who's working in the fields, does it really matter who the king is? Does it really matter who the nobles are? How are you getting that information if there's not a newspaper where you can read about it?
Right.
It's basically like they don't exist. Or if they do exist, they're godly.
I will say that is probably one of the more fundamental questions that we have asked ourselves, which is whether the degree of integration, words like tethering have been used between the various groups, social, economic, and political groups within classic lowland Maya society. And there are those who believe exactly that the common folk, commoners, as we tend to refer to them, would not have seen or been impacted by rulers and the elites and their comings and goings, as it were, at all. So much so that if there are some who have suggested that, it might have taken them 20 years to realize that there was no more king in the palace after the collapse of the Maya, right? That they were so disarticulated from elite life and elite goings on.
Well, there's some pretty creepy human sacrifice aspects to the elite in these states, right? So I imagine that if you're a commoner and you know that outside of your main pyramid there is, a wall with 300 children's skulls on it, you're probably going to be like, I am going to make sure that I have no idea who these people are. They have no idea who I am. Because the alternative is that I run into that horrific machine that has an eternally hungry maw in which it wants to throw me.
Right. Well, okay. Yeah. So I can certainly get this set, but that is a form of, speaking entirely empirically, that's a form of integration that essentially involves coercion, right? The sort of the notion of fear as a regime of control and change of manipulation, right? Which is not what some scholars suggested. There was really there's very little interaction. I tend to believe that there was quite a bit of interaction and quite a bit of integration. What we're seeing, let's say, in all the LiDAR data, of course, is a huge amount of anthropogenic change in the landscape that involved a lot of activities that, while they might not have been state controlled, I don't say that they were by any stretch. There's a lot of cooperation. There's a lot of capital investment in the landscape. So much so that there was a sense of, this is a group of people living in an area, trying to improve it, trying to defend it, trying to protect it, trying to render it more productive, and so forth. That I think all of this suggests that the degree of communication, interaction, and so forth amongst and the groups of people that were beyond a single family, and so forth, was probably quite intense. Right?
Well, it's like the state. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead. No. The extent to which that then translates into state active direct control, right, is something that is a matter of discussion and a matter of debate. Of course,
That's
If I can
like
also just, yeah, no, go ahead.
the state cannot start off as a tyranny. It must start off as something collaborative in the first place. Like it seems like it serves a purpose at first, and there's like this evolution. Actually, it's not really an evolution because it doesn't necessarily lead to anything better, but it's a metamorphosis in each state where it serves a role to these people, these disparate villages at some point, and at some point they must find that it is no longer serving that role.
I think that's a pretty big assumption that the state starts out as a collaborative endeavor rather than starting out by somebody.
Agreed.
Well, I think it's tradition. I think most people think of states as being these top-down imposed structures, but I think that I'm not convinced of that. I think that people form associations and groups and governments locally because it's the most efficient way to administer. Really, like you made this point originally, Dr. Canuto. You said that the more interlinked peoples are, the more subject they are to terrible perturbations in one arm of that. But there's also, in a very functional federation, you actually have the ability to buffer any sorts of situations like that by supplying resources to the devastated community. And to some extent, this is what we do in the United States or in the global West, right? We're always rushing to the aid of people who are suffering from various natural disasters and so forth. So it seems like the only reason that would cease to achieve its ends, right, that the state would cease to be effective is if something corrupted it to the extent that it couldn't actually function to keep people happy and keep people trading.
This circles back to something we were talking about, is we're talking about the state, right? And one thing we recognize is that, during the height of Maya civilization, there were 100 states. We're talking about independent city-states that were responsible for calling their own shots. And a few of them were successful in adopting smaller, less effective clients and building, collaborative regimes, collaborative networks. But none of them achieved what we would call, a single nation state that covered the Maya area. So if there was a devastating drought in this particular region, that affected, say, 10 city-states and maybe a couple of their partners, but not the whole area. This isn't, New Orleans being struck by a devastating hurricane, and then the federal government that was unaffected by it being able to marshal resources and get them to that area. Or even, say, the devastating San Francisco earthquake of the early 20th century, with the rest of the country eventually catching on to it and supplying it. If a whole bunch of city-states in southern Belize were completely wiped out, that meant nothing, probably, to groups of people living at Tikal and at Calakmul, because we have no attested connections with them. But maybe nearby ones could collapse by virtue of the fact that that's their breadbasket, and other nearby areas had to seek new allies because now they couldn't depend on that particular one. So there wouldn't have been a coordinated response. But these states weren't that big. Yeah.
What I would say though, Mark, is also that if we don't have a politically unified area that does that kind of concerted response, but the economic, social, and demographic systems are all interdigitated in different ways.
Yeah.
Then what you'll get is this kind of local responses that are sort of reacting to a particular problem that might push and pull things apart in a way that a system needs to sort of be integrated. So while that might not politically impact these other areas, what it might have is a kind of a knock-on effect, because it then it causes everyone to react locally, right, in sort of emergency responses. And emergency responses are never multiple emergency responses are never good for the entire system, or the health of the entire system as it goes forward. So in the sense of, while New Orleans might have had Katrina, and it was then helped from a concerted effort from a federal perspective, what if the port of New Orleans ceased to exist, and that had knock-on effects for the economy of other states and so forth, and then creating a kind of a domino? That, I think, is probably, that's what I meant by it. An interdigitated system can be more rigid, and they're more brittle. Excuse me. And anyway, these are all questions that are related to sort of resilience, right? The system, how resilient is it to change, right? And whether a state can be a mitigating factor to help that to marshal resources from one area to another. That's probably a good 2/3 of a reason why empires grow is to actually create a large enough region where problems in one area, ecological droughts in one area, can be mitigated by movement of resources to that area and vice versa when it impacts others, right? Sort of a kind of buffering. I would point out that in the case of a state, that is what you're talking about there, about a state being initially useful and so forth. That you're this is essentially one of the basic discussions we have about the rise of what we call complexity in the archaeological record, right? Which is, why do we go from a long period of hunter-gathering and perhaps some semi-mobile existence with agriculture being a part of our diet, to something that ends up being highly sedentary, highly hierarchical states? How does that happen, right? What are the reasons? And the notion of an administrative managerial state, which is essentially what you're talking about, was one of the first models, right? The state was needed because it provided a way for groups of people to organize at a greater scale, so that they could all benefit, right? This was the sort of the notion of the managerial state, and then you would need elites to manage that and so forth. Scholarship across the world is showing that initial function of states may not be the case, may not be actually as common as you might think. That there are perhaps other reasons why people will devote their labor and time to the construction of monuments, or the construction of cities, or of temples and so forth, for other reasons that might still not be entirely understood, but are not related directly to a pragmatic solution to everyday problems, right? And that's essentially it remains an open question. You speak to most any archaeologist, and they will have a different take on why complexity develops. And certainly for the Maya region, it's one of many examples of this that's still debated.
Well, there seems to be a cyclic complexity, right? It seems like civilizations rise, the state falls apart, and people do return to a more tribal existence for periods of time, and then the states reform. It seems like there's this birth and death cycle of civilizations.
Yes. And one thing to remember about that is archaeology is not a democratic discipline, in the sense that we don't find the same amount of evidence of across a particular period of time. In other words, what's visible and what preserves our temples, our palaces, right? And so archaeology has a problem just from a preservation perspective, in terms of being able to talk about these ups and downs, because they look much more stark in the archaeological record, because one day they're there and one day they're not. But that's a monument. That's a big building. There's probably a lead up to that, and then a decline off of that. That is a lot harder to pick up on archaeologically, because they don't leave the same material remains. And so that's something that we also have to remember, that we're looking through an imperfect lens, right? That is what is preserved and how things are preserved. And that's another wild card in all of this, right? But the rise and fall, if you will, or the rise and decline of civilization are seen through their constructions, through their architectures, through their material products. And that's not entirely, as I say, democratic in its accessibility over time.
Another way to think of it is, if we bring back those Greek historians we talked about, their view of this kind of thing, summarizing a lot of evidence from their own ancestral civilizations and others that they saw around the world, was that human cultures change, human civilizations change, but human nature doesn't change, right? We're okay, often, most people are okay, buying into a civilization and administrative structure if things are going well, right? There's no sign, for instance, that during the height of Maya civilization, the commoners or people of middle ranks or others rejected the idea of human sacrifice or avoided taking part in it. We know that commoners on their own fields would, let blood to the gods, would sacrifice children. We find sacrificial bodies in caves that have nothing to do with elite behavior, right? But we know that administrations bloat over time. That's human nature. And if we get to a point where it is in excess of expectations and the commoners are suffering, right? Maybe they're not redistributing food appropriately, right? Then we have the lack of buy-in. Suddenly, there's no reason to put up with this anymore. Maybe, in fact, the administration bloats so much that there's too many people consuming and not enough people producing. And we have the kind of destabilization that could lead to collapse. It's probably no surprise, human nature being what it is, that when we look around the world, we see that all ancient civilizations have collapsed. We find very, very little signs of continuity. One probable exception is China, right? For a long period of time, going back to at least 1200 BC, we have a group and a continuity. The same writing system has been around now for 3,200 years. Not to say that it hasn't undergone changes, and not to say that there haven't been some tremendous recalibrations of centers of power, but that would be the most successful long-term experiment in some ways. And not everyone would want to live in contemporary China necessarily if they had their choice of all of the different, political structures.
Well, they had enormous bureaucracies too, right? They have some of the most incredible, 1,000-year bureaucracies. It's unbelievable. How are they? I mean, totally out of your wheelhouse, I'm sure, but how are they able to avoid this administrative? How are they able to avoid this catastrophic?
Occasionally, of course, all of those administrative individuals have been put to death, haven't they? We've had the Red Revolution, and all people in all universities, either co-opted or ended. So there have been some pretty drastic revolutions within what we still consider to be a continuing structure. Maybe that's the cost of keeping, the structure going in those kinds of places. In other places, it's just ended, hasn't it? Rather than continued in other guise. Yeah.
There's been a growing interest in resilience theory, or resiliency theory in archaeology. And really what we're learning from resiliency theory is that resilience doesn't necessarily mean that the system stays the same, and it just is able to absorb different change, absorb conflicts or absorb external changes. What happens is it modifies its system internally in different ways, and certain aspects of that system suffer more than others for the good of the whole system, right? So in other words, you can see this as being, this civilization or the society lasted for 1,000 years and was able to maintain a certain stability despite all of these challenges that they were faced with, ecological and whatnot. But if you look more carefully at it, what's happening, resilience there, or responses to those challenges, mean they're highly modifying certain aspects, or they're lowering population, or they're reducing, they reduce population quality of life and so forth in different ways just to maintain certain parts. So maintenance of certain things, i.e. language, writing, monuments, and political systems, might come at a cost, but those costs are harder to see archaeologically because they might relate to people who leave a much smaller material signature, right? And so there's this notion of continuity, but actually there's a lot of change underneath that's trying to absorb these impacts or these challenges in different ways, and that's perhaps when one of the things that might be happening with the classic Maya is that there was not enough resilience in the system to absorb these changes and maintain kind of a veneer of continuity, right? To me, the notion of continuity and change and so forth are words to describe a kind of a long-term adaptation to particular conditions, right? And some have said, basically the decline of lowland Maya civilization was just an adaptive response, right? It was a perfectly reasonable response to what was going on. That the question is adaptive for whom, right? There's no reason to suggest that life after the Great Maya collapse overall was worse for some people, right? Granted, it was a demographic disaster, most likely. That, of course, means a lot to the people who were living it, but there might have been a great deal of coercion in a system. And so some people might say, well, this was a system that eventually could not last, could not hold, and would eventually come to an end. I'm not saying that that's the case. I'm simply saying that there has been in archaeology this kind of assumption that complexity improves lives, and I don't necessarily I don't suggest that that's necessarily true. Right?
But this is the trad life versus techno accelerationist debate, right? Which is, do we lean harder
traditional life
in
versus techno,
right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like the people that are basically, the
hashtag trad life.
the Bronze Age pervert followers, and because there's an entire realm of people who believe that the answer is to return to traditional cultural mores and to pick back up where they pinpoint Western civilization to have been at some sort of, small village family pinnacle. And then there's the people that are on the other side that are I honestly think that the biocosmists are probably sitting on the other side of that, and their motto is go anywhere, do anything, be anyone. And that is a fundamental, it's a prayer to the ability of technology to give you anything that you want. And so we see these two sides playing out. And
very much so.
That must have also been the case in any society where you have a complex structure, where the people that are living in that complex structure and are tied up into it suddenly wake up and they realize they don't like it so much. For example, I don't know if you saw this going around, there was a stunning article that had interviewed some of the Taliban fighters that had taken over Afghanistan, and the guy was mourning the fact that now that they had control, he had to go work a 9-to-5 job in an office every day.
Right.
And he's like, we're not.
But it makes sense. Yeah.
You're right with that. Yes.
Right. Can't be a revolutionary anymore. You just have to be a day laborer. Now.
You're a bureaucrat. Yeah. You're a bureaucrat. Like you won.
Right.
Welcome to hell.
I'll go back to a point that I made earlier, which is that's all of those different theories are fine and good, but then ask yourself, what population size, what demographic scale do they require, right? In other words, it goes back to those different models are modeling different populations. We can talk about returning to some kind of village life and so forth, but what that return is, how many people lived in that system, right? How many people do we have now in the world, and can we? These things will change, right? You cannot have that's getting back to the point of the demographic levels or scales have to be the starting point. If you have X amount of people to support that need support because they exist, what systems are there available to make that plausible? And models that talk about models that talk about expansion and colonizing other planets and so forth are all about this notion that our basically population will drive us to that, right? And we will need to do that from that perspective, right? And as I was saying,
and science will inevitably solve every new problem that's created by
exactly right. These are standard models of the way that people have thought about population driving technology and innovation and so forth. And one could say that the demographic collapse of the Maya might have been a way to actually resolve that question, quote unquote, resolve that question in a very drastic way. But it might have resolved. It might have resulted to create a society that was perhaps more long-term sustainable. One might say, well, it was around for 2,000 years. That's a pretty good run, right? What do you mean by sustainability? Well, maybe it had gotten to a point where the degree of population, the complexity and so forth required required an innovation or required a downsizing, as it were. Right?
I wonder, we talked earlier about the language in the cities perhaps being this glossy language of the elite that's akin to Latin, and that the indication of a demographic collapse is in the fact that these peripheral languages don't appear to have absorbed a large amount of the, elite language speakers. But did they absorb other customs? Like, for example, human sacrifice. It's hard to not think of that as being a custom that would travel with people who were part of these large city structures. Do we see that as something that...
But you're assuming that it came with the state, right? That people weren't already doing tribal human sacrifice.
For some reason, I imagine it as a statecraft.
That's right. Yeah.
No,
unfortunately, we can trace it all the way back to what we call the early formative period. So all different groups, even speaking non-Mayan languages in other parts of Mesoamerica, were already conducting human sacrifice. So the answer is it just continues in different places.
And we see it around the world too, right?
Of course, sure.
In all other cultures, tribal cultures.
Steps up and right. Yeah, I mean, human sacrifice and slavery are endemic to humans. It's been conducted all through history, everywhere we've ever had enough documents to see it. One of the great contributions of the modern world, to the extent that we can think of a few things that were new contributions, is the lack of human sacrifice now. And of course, increasing pressure against slaveholding societies. Although we haven't wiped out slavery either, have we? I mean, there's a new UNESCO report from just 2 months ago showing the peak places where slavery, or what we can call slavery, is still being conducted today.
And the spirit of human sacrifice is still there, right? Like, we love to see the stars screw up and ruin their careers, and people, I mean, really, politicians, people have the spirits
darker
there.
Elements of that, if you think about it, right? I mean, we sacrifice children to minority religious beliefs across the U.S. today, right? There's whole communities that can choose to not inoculate their children, that can choose to not seek medical treatment for them on the belief of faith healing. There are horror stories on a daily basis in the United States. Again, another UNESCO finding from just 10 years ago is thousands of children in the US every year are effectively sacrificed to the deity, aren't they? Because they avoid seeking medical attention because of religious beliefs.
I think
it's not as in your face as removing a heart in front of a huge crowd, but it's still religious sacrifice, if you think about it. And,
I think we have a very narrow understanding of sacrifice for non-Western cultures, and then that which blinds us to the fact that is a practice that occurs in different ways across the world and to today, right? So while yes, sacrificing, as you would say, the heart sacrifice, and so there's a kind of an exoticism to it. There's a sort of notion of othering other civilizations or other cultures and saying, oh, we don't do that. Okay, yes, perhaps not explicitly that, but the notion of sacrifice for a greater good is honored on a daily basis. When we think about wars that are being fought, in which we talk about even our own language says that where we sacrifice our was it a blood and treasure? I can't remember what the term.
Thank you for your sacrifice.
Thank you for your sacrifice and so forth. This is inherent in our notion.
I've heard this.
Yeah.
It's also usually our minoritized populations.
That's right.
In the lower social classes that are actually meant to hold up that sacrifice on behalf.
Well, if you look at our central Western religion, I mean, if you can say Christianity is our central Western religion, I mean, it's a dude nailed to a cross that God sacrificed, right? He sacrificed his son. I mean, it's still at the heart of this myth that we embrace.
You can't get something for nothing is the idea.
Notion of indebtedness, the notion of indebtedness that can only be paid through something as dear as life or blood or time or labor, whatever, and usually by people that don't necessarily aren't responsible for the problem at all, whatever that problem is that they're being sacrificed for. If you think about it in a broader term like that, then you can start putting it into context. Now, you can start understanding sacrifice in a little bit more kind of in a less alienating way, right? And I think that's really what's important to understand. I think that if you go back and look at why there's been fascination with sacrifice in Mesoamerican civilization from the time the Spaniards came to the New World and wrote about it, and of course, in their text, they in their initial stories or histories of their own conquest and their own relationships with the Aztecs and so forth, they really punched it up, if you will, to create a distinction, a difference, and a justification for a lot of the things that they were doing, to control and to manage and to entirely dominate this part of the world. And so that's fed into a Western view of these populations as conducting human sacrifice, right? Well, I think that I would say there's not a single society in the world that hasn't conducted human sacrifice in one way or another. And it's the terms that we use. For a long time, here's just a simple point. For a long time, we would interpret these murals or these images of people being beheaded, right? Or people being bloodied and so forth in Maya art as examples of sacrifice, right? Later, we learned the text that accompanied these images were talking about captives of war, right? And then, of course, the language was, they sacrificed the captives of war because that's what they were doing. Maybe you can think of it as they were killing their enemy, right? And what is, maybe that was their form of quote unquote, if we use our language, that was a trial. They were convicted of attacking a state, or maybe they were former allies and therefore they were treasonous and therefore they are executed, right? Okay, those are the terms we like to use to justify that killing. Well, if you see it from a perspective of not understanding anything, that's sacrifice, right? And so why do we look at captives in a war being caught and then killed as sacrifice, human sacrifice, and not the execution of your enemy, right? Which is how we would understand it. We might have a trial and all those kinds of things, but in the end, whatever those might have been in the case of the Maya, they did exactly what we end up doing. So, to me, we have to be very careful using these terms. That doesn't necessarily mean we can then focus on child sacrifice. Sure, we can. There are examples in South America that are being studied of this kind of massive or continued use of child sacrifice and so forth that seem foreign to us, right? And I would agree that I don't want to. How do I put it? I don't want to put it all in one. Without we don't want to make any distinctions. No, I don't want. It's not that I want to do that. I just want to say if we think about it sort of in a more kind of structural way, we'll see that there's a place for sacrifice in every society.
We have to think of
different words for it.
We have to think of Abraham and Isaac in the Bible as well. I mean, the Judeo-Christian tradition is replete with, examples of child sacrifice. So this was a widespread human pattern.
It actually seems
that it would have existed before states is perfectly understandable, right?
Archaeologists regularly find children at the center of corner posts in some of the earliest constructions in the Levant. And so we know that child sacrifice is a continuing tradition there throughout what became the Jewish state, of course. And it's
interesting. The Christian tradition seems to have been the first time that people were like, all right, we're going to make it a metaphor. We're not going to actually kill things anymore, because that's the central departure from the Jewish faith at that point, was that they're not going to be doing physical sacrifices anymore. It's like, and I think that's why it's so shocking to people in the West, is because we're like, oh, well, we stopped doing that a while ago. And,
they
maybe don't recognize that's where they come from.
I would say some of those wool shirts that people used to wear to undertake penance is a form of blood is a form of blood sacrifice that we find around the world as well, right? So I think it is just embedded in different ways, and I think that's important.
The ascetic tradition, right, of monasteries and people fasting. All of those are different kinds of developments of the idea of.
Well, it must be important, right? I mean, there must be something at the heart of that that's absolutely essential to our conduct as human beings on Earth. Just the basic idea, you need to give something up if you want to get something, is a very tricky thing
Nothing's
to master.
Free, it seems to be.
That's right. That's right. Exactly.
And it's
Particularly
not so
relationships with the divine, right? Whether you envision actually a deity or a pantheon or departed ancestors or spirits or ghosts, they don't do things for free. And so you have to give something that's valuable. We often don't think about that when we talk about sacrifice, and of course we repudiate it, which seems a natural enough thing to do. But the idea of sacrifice is that you are giving up something that you value. It doesn't suggest the devaluation of human life that it's sacrificed, but that it's the most precious thing you can give.
That's right.
Whether we agree with the belief or that you should hold the belief, right, that the deities want that is a whole other question. But you're sacrificing children because you value them and you're willing to give them up because you believe that is what your deities, your kings are requiring of you, right?
And
what you're willing to do as long as the corn crop is coming in and everybody's living fine. But if that fails and there's a massive drought, you start to wonder whether the king and the priests should be allowed to ask that of you.
That's right.
And that's where things start to fall apart.
If they are no longer the effective the go-betweens, then there might be an issue with those go-betweens that you'll take that kind of causes a crisis of faith, right?
But if it's inherent as part of something that all Mesoamerican societies do and all human cultures do, then why would the drought change that significantly if it's just an inherent aspect of what people will do anywhere always, because that's just
the drought will just cause them to lose faith in their priests.
I mean, at the beginning, you would assume we haven't been doing it enough, and you would ramp it up, right? And that's what we see, and we see good evidence of now this calibration of speleothems, stalactites and stalagmites in caves can be checked, and we can use it to see rainfall patterns, right? And it's getting increasingly sophisticated. So we can see them not just on an annual basis, but even on a seasonal basis. And we recognize, in fact, that there are more, burials and sacrifices in places like caves and gullies and canyons where they preserve at the peaks of things like droughts. But if it gets severe enough that everybody's starving and dying around you, there's no resources to tap into, that's when faith would break. But at first, of course, it wouldn't, right? You would just assume you haven't been doing it properly or doing it enough. And, religion is adaptable that way. But eventually it becomes impossible to sustain. And that would be one vector of collapse. But there must be other pressures as well. Yeah.
In terms of, if there's millions of people that are living in this area, and by the 9th century, the area has been emptied, and there's no evidence for dissemination into the peripheral states, where did all those bodies go?
Yeah, I mean, you can see there's a rainforest right there, right? And so, at first, the jaguars ate a fair bit, but inevitably it's all of the beetles and all of the insects and all of the bacteria that simply decompose those. Bones and any other human body parts simply don't preserve in a tropical American environment.
And there's no swamps?
Maybe if somebody died in the middle of a big field, there are swamps, of course, too. Yeah, but not the kinds of, peat or other kinds of anaerobic environments that preserve, say, bodies. Right. So there's no bog bodies in Central America any more than the Amazon. And we think now, LIDAR again, the revolution, right? There were huge populations and large settlements in what's now the Amazon rainforest. And those people all went somewhere as well. It starts to seem unlikely that they all migrated somewhere else. And unfortunately, nature takes care. Ashes to ashes, I think, dust to dust. Humans just decay.
The soils are extremely acidic, and that's one of the problems with human remains in our particular area. I would also point out that the timing of it is very important to think, or the duration of it, right? It's not a one generation change. It's not 750 and then 800 all is gone. We're probably talking about a decline in population that takes somewhere between 100 and 150 years, right? From 800 to 950 or so, right? In kind of steps and so forth. So what we're seeing is likely not something that would suddenly have massive die-offs within a year or two or 5 years or whatnot, but a kind of a declining population that isn't reproducing at the rate that would be to replace what the previous generation, as well as some movement away, and as well as a declining materially visible existence, right? That is perhaps slightly more rural, in which case archaeology doesn't pick it up as easily and so forth. That kind of lend itself to this notion that there was that we see in the archaeological record. It probably took slightly longer than a generation or two, right? I think that's a really important point to realize. We have examples of certain cities lasting into 900 or 920. I can't remember what the latest hieroglyphic date is on those monuments now. It's somewhere in the early 900s.
A fair number of those are probably people returning and
yes,
sort of trying to reignite something. But no, absolutely agreed. I mean, when you're talking about millions of people, even just 2 generations is a remarkable loss. And archaeologically, it's an instant, and so yeah, we can be forgiven for talking about it. It's been the height and then just gone. But yeah, in terms of real mechanics for how that area depopulated, there are probably stories. We know that there are stories of holdouts. People tore down facades of buildings and put up gigantic walls to keep people out. So they were camping out in the middle of what had once been the White House lawn, effectively. And other places where they simply, maybe a large number of people did die, right? Others where they migrated to another place and held out for a little while. But there would have been a whole bunch of epic little individual stories.
Exactly.
Obviously, we don't have them. But you can imagine a kind of a Walking Dead television show over several seasons, talking about very, very different experiences as the society was collapsing in different places. With holdouts,
different experiences, exactly.
New mini potentates are rising to take advantage of the fact that now the big potentates are gone, but not lasting very long. There would have undoubtedly been a lot of scenarios that were highly varied over that area.
Where the area became less and less regional and more local, right?
Right, yeah. Lots of little tiny mini fiefdoms.
Exactly. Balkanized is the term we often use.
It's sort of like us leaving the city because it's expensive. We're just out here. You can imagine that happening though, at some point where the city just doesn't serve you anymore.
And I don't know, think of archaeologically, what are the chances? I don't know where you live right now, but what are the chances of finding evidence of the building that you live in New York versus the building that you live in now, right? 2,000 years from now, right? Multiply that by hundreds of thousands, and you get also the unevenness of what we can see archaeologically as a factor in our understanding of our interpretation of what's going on.
Yeah, one interesting. I mean, we don't often think about how quickly bodies disappear if they're left out in the open. But this is the whole point of a large number of what we can loosely call burial practices or interment practices across the southern U.S., right? The idea of the sky burials, where people are put up on top of local hills or things. So the vultures first pick them, and then it doesn't take too long until insect life and bacteria and other things, decompose them, and eventually even the bones are gone. And presumably, people who died out in the open, that would be the outcome. Fields where people have died in massive battles are like that, right? Some places weren't cleaned up after World War I or World War II until considerable time, and there's not much left to bury. Just fields full of dog tags and no bones and things left. So we have some pretty good pieces of evidence, cross-culturally and historically about what can happen to a battlefield. Probably one of the most famous ones is the great battle in the Teutoburg Forest between the legions of Varus and the Germanic folks underneath Hermann or Arminius, right? Where we know from the historical record where it happened and how many people died, and the whole legion and a half were wiped out. But it was lost because nothing had survived. It was only when metal detectorists started to find greaves and weapons and things like that suddenly the things that they were wearing, pieces of metal they were wearing, have all been recovered, but none of the bones of any of those Romans. That would be an explanation for what happened to some of these large numbers of people in the Maya area, at least some of them.
Yeah, it's hard to keep track of how much of the record is missing. And I was trying to bring this up earlier in terms of other sciences as well, but you can only see what you can see. And I think it's really obvious in geology where there's sometimes a billion years of record just obliterated.
Right. Yeah.
But it plays into other sciences too, and it's wild. Like I'm teaching astronomy, and that's a really interesting one too, because you can only see things that are bright, essentially, or things that are hot. And so there's so much cold, dim
issue.
Yeah, everything is cold and dim when it turns out. Most of the stars are cold and dim. Most of the planets are cold and dim, right? So you're limited in the stories you tell and the theories that you can stand behind to the ones that are fixated on the evidence that is before you and most visible. And
it's one of the things that makes the lens conceit work the best, doesn't it? I mean, so much of science is based on our lenses. We can start to see the really, really small things. We start to realize how much of a microscopic world there is. It doesn't seem to stop. It keeps going into the, subatomic and even lower. And the same is true, of course, with the bigger and bigger lenses we build, right? How big is the universe? As big as our biggest lens, right? Because we still can't see the,
and that blows people's minds when you tell them, like when you tell intro astronomy students, you're like, what do they mean by universe? And, people say, well, it's everything or whatever. And you're like, actually, they just mean everything they can see. And so when you start talking about the birth of the universe, the birth of everything you can see, it starts becoming a little more rational, the conversations that you're producing, right? But it can seem so daunting when you treat everything you can see as if it is everything that is. This is quite a leap. Which I think leads to a lot of confusion.
Huge debates that tore up the field of paleontology, particularly bioanthropology or physical anthropology between the Leakeys and the Johansons. Right? It's the same data set, but it's so small, so fragmentary. Entire branches of the human evolutionary tree based on one tooth or half of a mandible. You can really see what the limits of evidence can do. Particularly if you take it as somehow being representative, of the totality. It's complete accident that preserves archaeological and paleontological evidence for us, and yet that's the only direct evidence we have if we're talking about the human story, isn't it? So there are real limits sometimes to what we can say, and it's important to remember every so often that we're arguing about what has preserved rather than exactly everything that might be inferable one day, or what we'll know as more discoveries are made.
Yeah, it seems to get forgotten sometimes in the popular literature, and really even amongst scientists themselves, where they get really, really entrenched in their ideas, which are built on foundations that are potentially incomplete. And I think
there is an inverse to that, which is just as important, which is there are certain things that we don't see that we know we would be able to see if they were to happen there, right? Based on analogy, right? And so that does not then give us license to say, oh, it's not there. We haven't found it yet. Therefore, it's possible. Right?
An absence of evidence is evidence.
An absence of evidence, exactly. But it is important to understand. And this is the very complicated nature of the archaeological record or of any kind of record, right? What we can see, what we can hear, what our senses allow us to perceive, and the technology we use to increase our senses so that we can perceive more is important to understand that it's limited. But sometimes that those limitations, we know that if something did happen, or that something did exist, or could have happened, we would find evidence for it, right? And therefore, the lack of that evidence does, in fact, perhaps suggest that there isn't something there. And so that's a very subtle kind of question that only comes through a lot of experience dealing with a particular data set, knowing when we just don't know because it's possible that it's not there and we can't see it, and also knowing it's not there because we know that we would have seen it by now, right? And that's something that is an important kind of question that we have to keep in mind, right? Is from whether it's in astronomy or in archaeology, looking down on the ground, looking up in the sky, right? Those are the kinds of questions that are where scholars have to be responsible with what the data set can say and what it really stays mute on, right?
I think that's really important.
Yeah, and archaeology has one of those reputations of like, well, you haven't found evidence yet, so maybe it's true. right? We encounter that a lot in our
ancient aliens.
right? Yeah, exactly. Well, it could be.
We wanted to ask you guys about that.
Civilizations.
Not about ancient aliens, but
The pseudoscientific way of saying, if that prove me wrong, right? Well,
there's a lot of there's popularization of that. That's a really popular angle, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, I've been watching Graham Hancock's series, and I think that the first 2 episodes, it really starts going off the rails, I think right around episode 3, where he makes this comparison between the Eye of Horus and this eye that is found on fishing boats, I think in Malta. And he's basically they're the exact same symbol. And there's this really sketchy cutaway where it's like a picture of the eye on the boat and then literally like 5 frames of an Eye of Horus, which looks nothing like the thing that's on the boat. And then it goes to Graham Hancock's face and it's like his eye's really big. And you're like, that's
actually perfect, right? Graham Hancock's eye comes from the Eye of Horus. I didn't even know that. It's like, just the one eye rather than the other one. So we have to posit different origins for his 2 eyes. Yeah.
Oh, but like my point is I'm like, Graham, number 1, like I'm beginning to see why people have such a hard time with you, because if you're making a good argument, you don't have to be tendentious. Like if your argument is solid, you don't have to do like editing trickery to make it look like it's a solid argument. You should just be able to calmly lay out your facts and be like, look, these look a lot alike, and somebody with an attentive, curious mind would look at it and be like, oh, that's really interesting. That does kind of look similar. But he's so invested in selling the story of what it might look like that it's lost, right? Because like I think episode 4, he goes to like Göbekli Tepe, and then the next episode is Atlantis. And I haven't delved into like the full extent of what lies beneath the Atlantis theory. But
the good news is there isn't anything. So yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that it's really valuable to at least look at his presentation so that when I'm like, hey, that's a bad presentation, I can make specific points of like why it's bad.
Yeah,
but he makes a really interesting case in the first couple of episodes where he's like, look, there do appear to be these really old settlements that have more complexity to them than we would have expected from hunter-gatherers in the Stone Age.
I'm gonna say this. There's what he's talking about in Göbekli Tepe is a perfect example of what archaeology does and how it works. Exactly the opposite of what he says, right? In other words, where the evidence is strong, there's absolutely nothing that there's. How do I put this? Göbekli Tepe is not something that we are denying and that we are ignoring, or the dates are confirmed to be much older than what we found in that area before. And the monumentality.
Göbekli Tepe is a good example of archaeology working, right? It's
right,
archaeologists
exactly.
that uncovered it.
Archaeologists
that date it. It's
that's
archaeologists that
his argument is not that archaeologists are idiots for uncovering Göbekli Tepe. His argument is, hey, this is a sufficiently difficult construction that it's unlikely that this is the very first time that somebody was like, let's build a city, and then they got Göbekli Tepe out of it.
His argument is circular because he creates a false premise that somehow hunter-gatherers couldn't have done this, and then says, well, Göbekli Tepe proves that it's not hunter-gatherers. That's his presumptions are incorrect.
Well, his presumption is that you would have to find, like, his presumption is that Göbekli Tepe is a pinnacle of something, not the beginning of something. He's like, there has to be something way older that lies before Göbekli Tepe to get to something of that level of complexity. Okay.
But there is. And archaeology is finding those. In other words, Göbekli Tepe is a site that came to existence after a process of other tepes in the same region being developed over, a relatively long span of time, 1,000 years and so forth. Maybe I can't remember exactly, but I think it's
900 1,000 years or more.
It's about over 1,000 years, where Göbekli Tepe is then a very large version of other tepes that are much smaller that are using and experimenting with that kind of technology. My point simply being that what he does is he takes this one site, creates a mystery around it as if it came out of nothing. And in fact, what we're learning archaeologically is that it didn't come out of nothing, but there are explanations for it if you look at the nitty-gritty of the archaeological data.
It's not different in time that what he's done since we first became aware of him, right? I mean, so he's had a long career. If we go back 20 years, he was doing exactly the same thing that he's doing now with Göbekli Tepe, right? With the Great Pyramid,
That's right.
the pyramids of Giza, completely ignoring the fact that archaeologists, Egyptologists had already shown a long, slow, continuing process of building bigger and bigger kinds of pyramids, experimenting with different technologies, and then finally producing, these apexes, right? Khufu and Mycerinus and Khafre's pyramids, right? Which is archaeology that's supposed to be working. Right? The specialists understood that they were already looking at a cultural sequence in situ. There were gaps in the sequence that they hadn't found yet or didn't know about, so they were starting to experiment with them. And he comes in as a journalist or whatever he wants to call himself and says, look at how big this thing is. Nobody could have guessed how big it was. Nobody knows where it came from. Must be from a lost super scientific civilization that preceded it. In the meantime, everybody who's a specialist in the pyramids and the local history was scratching their heads going, we've been talking about this forever. There's a lot of publications. There's a long history of slow development in situ. We can see where they made a mistake in the one they built 20 years before this one, and they fixed it in this one, right? It's kind of head scratching.
So it is. It's an extremely selective use of the archaeological evidence to create this notion that there must have been a precedent civilization that we don't know about, right? And I can guarantee you that if we had evidence for something like that, we would be talking about it. Right. There's absolutely not a single archaeologist that I know who upon finding some evidence of something of that kind wouldn't be the first to publish it and discuss it. Right. There's this notion that there's some narrative that we've all bought into, and that we don't want the world to know because our reputations are based on it or whatever, is ludicrous to the point of being insulting, right?
It is difficult to change. It's difficult to change these timelines and narratives, right? Because occasionally you'll see somebody who finds, well, like for example, there's this. There was an excavation site in San Diego where they dug up a bunch of spherical objects and some bones that had tool markings on them. And the guy who excavated the site was proposing that it was 200,000 years old, maybe older.
Right.
And so there's definitely pushback against somebody who's coming through and saying that this site is 200,000 years old.
But remember, nobody stopped him from publishing on it, which he did. Nobody stopped him from publicizing it, which he did. But the way science works is people say, well, let me see your data.
That's right.
Does it support what you're saying? That's the way it's supposed to work.
Exactly.
Whereas Graham Hancock will hold it up as being an example that, we're all acolytes and we're all following the same model and nobody will allow it to be what it is. So if the field just said, hey, you're not allowed to publish any of this, you're not allowed to say any about it, then it would be like he's pretending that it is. But in point of fact, nothing stops people from presenting what they believe to be this kind of evidence, whether anybody is willing to accept it or teach it in their own classes or consider it to be held up. That's the way it's supposed to operate.
What is very simple in archaeology about changing anything is providing the appropriate data and evidence. That's it, right? That's always difficult. Now, what is understood to be appropriate data and so forth can change over time, but the nature of the discipline is one in which any new earth-shattering idea, like Carl Sagan says, requires with the phrase an extraordinary claim needs extraordinary evidence. That's simply how science works, right? But if you have clear evidence, Göbekli Tepe is a perfect example, right? The evidence is overwhelming. There's not anyone who denies its existence, right? If there were indications of an even older phenomenon, civilization for which we had a shred of evidence, direct evidence that is, it wouldn't be difficult to have that accepted. Honestly, I don't mean to sound somewhat how do I put this, but firm on this, but it's very easy for archaeology has been changing its paradigm over the last 100 years, or even 200, 150 years. The paradigms that we use now to understand ancient society, the things that we've known, we've come leaps and bounds from what we knew in 1880.
Of
right?
course. The question at the heart of all of this is whether or not the dating for the timelines is correct, because you can't date the stone. You don't know when it was built. You know when it was inhabited.
Correct. So you can't throw out a date based on supposition. You need the material that can be dated.
Right. So a lot of the ways in which alternative, I think I should preface this by saying that I don't buy into Graham Hancock's theories. I don't buy into the theories that extrapolate the age of the cities, because we had Michael Cremo on the show, and Michael Cremo's like, humans have been around for 50 million years. This is like Vedic cosmology. You can throw stuff out that is huge claims with very scant evidence, and there's an enormous population that's going to latch onto them because it is attractive and cool and wondrous and fulfills deep-seated desires. And so with that preface set, I think that's something that's really interesting, is that there are a couple of people who are attempting to look at the alignment of temples relative to either stars or equinoxes, and so solar positions, and are trying to extrapolate dates on the basis of that. And so there is data, and the data that they're using is an interpretation of the organization of the cities. And the data that they're getting out of it is data that is in direct conflict with what the accepted timelines are. And yet, it's still evidence-based. And I think that because Graham Hancock is such a popularizer, and because he's such a...
Well, let's be honest, those books were really fun to read. I read them like 20 years ago, and I was like, damn, this is amazing.
He's good. He's good at what he does. And so what happens is that he raises the immune system of the community to an immense degree because he's an inflammatory figure. Like when you listen to him make his presentation.
Inflammatory, yes.
Yeah, exactly. Like you listen to him make his presentation, and he is inflammatory, and people are upset with him, and the people who are within the academic community then develop a reaction against the ideas contained within it, because anything that has the whiff of legitimizing this asshole is something that people are not at all interested in considering. And it's really, I think that we see this in science all the time. There's really crazy ideas at the fringe that are upsetting to people and that are threatening and frustrating. And it's very, very hard for people who are invested in the academic superstructure to open themselves up to those ideas, because it is way more costly to spend your career being like, yo, I think that there's reason to shift this, than it is to just be like, you know what? We can wait on that question for a long time. I don't have to explore it. I don't have to entertain it.
Yeah, I mean, a big question though is there any there? You say they're pointing out these things and those are evidence-based, but what if they're completely empty? What if you have good reason by comparing other cultures and other civilizations and the alignments of their temples to know that there really is no way forward? There's no way to prove or disprove that idea. So it's therefore a semantically empty, untestable, non-scientific notion. That puts Graham Hancock squarely with Eric von Daniken or the flat earth acolytes, right? Who all cherry pick certain kinds of things that seem to support their view. And as you say, produce a reaction. But he likes to pretend that that's not his whole point, doesn't he? Right? That he would really love to just be investigating this lost, Adamic civilization, right? But he's not allowed to because he's constantly battling, the superstructure of the archaeologists or whatever. But that's exactly what Eric von Daniken did. That's exactly what Churchward did when he wanted to talk about Mu. That's their whole point. The way they make graft is by saying that they're being attacked.
Yeah.
And then they're as inflammatory as they can be so that they do get some attacks, so they can point to those attacks and say, look, see, I'm being attacked. But the fact is that if he had come up, even in any of these inflammatory things, with something that was really worth investigating, then actual archaeologists would already be investigating it. If they hadn't thought of it by themselves, none of us are so immune to what is actually a good idea that we would avoid pursuing it, even if it came from a lunatic, right?
Is he
There
insulated?
is no there there.
Let me say
Because
this.
if you put a building on the landscape, I'll leave it to you right after this, Marcello.
Sure, sorry.
Building on a landscape, let me just build it at random. I'll give it 4 corners, okay? Then open yourself to the night sky. Those buildings point at something. It's inevitable that they have an alignment with something in the heavens because there are millions of stars in the heavens. And so the simple fact that a building looks like it might be pointing its doorway at a star isn't evidence. It can't be evidence because it's inevitable.
That's a hypothesis, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe you can't even really call it an hypothesis
would-
because that needs to have something feeding into it besides that. So how do you test it? Well, if there's an inscription in it that you can then decipher and you know the language and it says this points at, Caprica and it's rising, then you're good, right? But if it doesn't, in the absence of that, it has to point at something, and so it's meaningless. It's semantically empty.
Is Graham insulated from like, does he have friends who are archaeologists? Have you ever met him or talked to him? Does anybody talk to him? Can we call him up
He's
right
got
now?
archaeologists that show up in his shows.
There's some who have tried, and as always, he they've argued with him. He argues back, and he himself promotes a particular video where he's trying to argue with a famous Egyptologist, and the Egyptologist storms out of the room because you won't debate with a man who is going to bring up all sorts of race-based theories that are completely rejected. Now, what I will say about this, and one thing you mentioned about evidence, George Bernard Shaw once was famously noted with people drying their clothes against rocks. He said that's the most complicated way to break rocks I've ever seen. Right? It was just sort of an inversion. And when you tell me about dating a building through constellations and so forth, we actually know how to date things, right? And the way you date things is through particular either ceramics, inscriptions. There's absolute dating, which is radiocarbon and so forth. Radiocarbon is made out of organic materials. Any settlement at any time with any number of humans at any point in history.
Well, up to like 50,000 years ago or something.
That's correct. That's correct.
Yeah.
For radiocarbon, but there are others that go even farther back. But you can get into those details. But let's just say radiocarbon. We're talking about 50,000. We're talking about the idea of the Younger Dryas and so forth. There's going to be evidence of human interaction of one kind or another that's going to leave that organic material. That is how you prove something is 10,000 years old or 12,000 or 15,000 years old. And we know how to do it, right? We know there is a procedure, there is a method, right? And there is nothing stopping anyone, Graham Hancock included, from trying to conduct research that would get the kind of data that you need to prove it. To say, oh, we can't date rocks, therefore I'm going to use this astronomical alignment, and then say, why don't people at least accept the possibility? Because there's an actual way of doing things that is going to get and resolve this issue. If you really wanted to resolve this issue, whenever you have a civilization, you have people, and people leave things behind. Refuge.
But just to play devil's advocate, you said like full fields of bodies, like 100,000 soldiers just disappear in the matter of 1,000 years or something.
Yeah,
sure.
You have massive environmental. Hold on. You also have massive environmental catastrophes. Like if you look at the Eastern Washington, you have the channeled scablands. If you had a human settlement in Eastern Washington prior to the end of the last ice age, you would not have any remnants of that because it is literally drilled down to bare rock by the passage of 1,000 feet of water.
Sure. Well, my statement
pointing
is why
to a
would they
place
only
where,
be there?
but
Would they
pointing to a
only be
place
there?
where civilization isn't and saying there might have been one there isn't how we do science, right?
Exactly.
It might not be impossible that something like that could exist, but science requires us to have actual evidence to look at, right?
Well, but my point is that there is a resistance to catastrophism, which is very reasonable because we have a uniformitarian idea that the way that things happen is the way that they have always happened, and so we're not looking at massive, crushing, changes in the earth because we don't experience them by our very nature. We live in a very steady time period. And yet we know that in the last 100 years or so, there have been pretty significant shifts to catastrophism that have been very, 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 very difficult to demonstrate, and there was a lot of resistance, and those people faced a lot of ridicule. Like J. Harold Bretz, when he came up with the Missoula flood theory, was ridiculed for probably a decade or more, probably even longer. I actually think that it was maybe after his lifetime that people finally accepted it because someone figured out of how to actually be able to evaluate it. The people who came up with the Chicks Club meteor impact were also very not. They spent decades trying to get those ideas accepted. And there's a huge resistance to being able to say that, like, yo, catastrophes happen. And I understand that Graham Hancock's way of doing it is so infuriating that he's difficult to look at because he's
actually, he's just in a bed apart. I think there's no there for Graham Hancock. He's just a popularizer who's a high priest of, saying the archaeologists don't know anything or they are completely resistant. But let's take the Chicxulub meteor, right? At first, it was just, a gravitational deformity. People wondered if that could be, the actual one. It wasn't until people started looking, and there were enough people that were looking, ridicule or not, that we now have, definite direct evidence. We've been able to model what the impact site looks like. We know a lot about the fact that it actually occurred at the right time. When people first proposed it, they didn't know it was 67 million years old. It could have been one from 100,000 years ago, or, 2 million. The resistance is natural. But when there was direct evidence, then you could, then people could be won over. A brand new idea is going to have resistance at first.
I would say rather than resistance, because I think that brings in a kind of notion of fear. But skepticism, that is the basis we live off of, right? We have to be skeptical of new ideas because what we have so far in theory is built on strong evidence. And when something comes and says, no, you're entirely wrong, right? As I said, we want to change the paradigm of history. There's actually no paradigmatic change at all being asked of us to understand a younger Dryas civilization. Actually, in fact, it's the oldest paradigm of history, which is there's a grand civilization that taught everybody everything, right?
Which is Aryans,
right? Which is the colonialist European system of saying, oh, these people couldn't have done this on their own; they had to have been taught by somebody, right? So it's actually an incredibly old paradigm, and it's an incredibly and granted, in the latest presentation of it, that particular presentation. It cleans it of all of those kind of racial overtones. I don't think there's anything inherent in what he says in that particular docuseries that is racially charged at all. But the other earlier iterations of it are exactly the same iterations that resulted in saying there's no way that native populations could have, wherever in the world, could have done these things because they're too brutish and unsophisticated for these kinds of grand things, right? That's been the justification for European justification of colonialism around the world.
But as far as I understand everything that we've talked about today, the cities were not built by the people that are there now.
Right. I mean, the people that are there now, of course, are, people that have moved into the region, including other speakers of other Mayan languages. They aren't the direct descendants.
So the conclusion that there's no way that those people built those cities.
That's we're talking about a Maya. We're talking about a Maya group,
right? It's still an indigenous group. In fact, we know a lot about them from their skeletal population.
Exactly.
They're not aliens.
That's not talking about some external civilization coming out.
No. But what I'm saying is that, like, the idea that there was a group that knew something that the people there now don't does seem to be borne out. Whether or not, like, I'm not saying that they were from some other place, but there is pretty clearly a population that had technological abilities that were not preserved in the population that we see today.
take Rome. That would be the same example. There's many people that live in Rome today that don't know anything about how to build Roman concrete or those huge aqueducts, right? That's just been something that's been lost. I mean, but interestingly, if we circle back to Malta for a second, right? There are a lot of people that look at this and look at that alignment and think, hey, wow, what if that is a good way to describe it? But that is precisely what Hancock did with the Orion mystery 20 years ago, right? He pointed to the Great Pyramid and he said, look at these shafts. They all point up at Orion. There's no way they would have pointed up at Orion. Of course, they don't now, but they would have if this was built 10,000 years ago. So maybe the archaeologists are all wrong and it was built 10,000 years ago, not in 2600 BC. But of course, the radiocarbon dates, which are in all of the organic material in all of the plaster that puts all of those stones together. Every time you fish one out and you radiocarbon date it, it turns out the plaster between every stone in that pyramid goes back to 2600 BC. There are inscriptions inside the pyramid and the stones that were only opened up in the 19th century when they exploded into them. And you've got the names of Khufu and his work gangs and the people that mined those stones. They found the mines that correlate to that time period. Broken pieces of pottery that are embedded in it are the pottery style from 2600 BC. The local villages all date in their refuse that are the buildings of the workers. I mean, everything that we know Egyptologically from history, from language, from archaeology tells us when that thing was built. And here's the kicker. All of that was known when Graham Hancock proposed this, right? So that fact that he can point to Malta where they haven't done the radiocarbon dates yet to figure out what those temples are and that they have some neat alignment, that if it was the right alignment, it goes back that far. It's just empty until you actually put in the work to figure out, all the different ways that we know how to date things, how to put them into local cultural sequences. So it's just hard to get excited about any of that and connect it to the kind of resistance, or better said, skepticism that we have to mete out with new claims, right? A proper response now, in light of the Orion mystery, is when he says that about Malta to go, let's see what the radiometric dates are. Let's see any kind of evidence also that it goes back that far, because we know how badly misled you can be by what you consider to be a stellar alignment, right? It's just not interesting yet. There's no interest, not even a small bit, until we go beyond it. Yeah.
The people that seem to really change paradigms historically have been really obsessively careful workers. I'm thinking of Copernicus and Darwin and people who spent their whole lives trying their ideas out on their most intimate associates.
Who were also reputations of their own right.
Right. And I don't even think they were freaked out about their reputation so much as they wanted to be sure that they really understood things properly.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you that they were very, very careful and deliberate, and we could stand to see more of that for anybody who wants to be a paradigm breaker, I think. Because it's way too easy to come up with a notion with no evidence and throw it out there and get notoriety, right? But also, part of the reason they were so cautious is look what happened to Galileo Galilei. He wasn't cautious enough, right? House arrest, not allowed to publish anymore. The Roman Catholic
he was insulting the Pope. He wrote a play where he cast the Pope as an idiot called Simplicus. Like, that's
but it wasn't the only reason that he was put under house arrest, right?
No, but it's like
allowed to publish. Yeah.
This strikes back to the diplomacy thing. If you're somebody who has really crazy ideas, like Darwin, like, who else did you mention?
Copernicus.
You build coalitions and you go to the people who are the ones that are most able to evaluate your ideas. And you're like, I am a person with great humility. You are a person with great expertise. Together, we will perhaps be able to put together an argument that can shift the tide of human understanding, and we will gradually bring people into our circle and help it move in that direction. And anytime that I see somebody who's working on an idea that they spend about 75% of their time kicking the machine and talking about how stupid everybody inside the machine is and how no one will play with them and no one will listen to them, I'm like, that's probably because you're bad at playing with people, and you probably have an oversized ego that prevents you from being able to see the fallacy in your own arguments, and it's so painful to me.
Hence improve them, right? Yeah. That's the key.
And we have to not forget that what you're talking about with Darwin or Copernicus or Galileo, any of these famous examples, there was no academic community as we have today. All those people that spend time carefully their whole lives doing this are now understood as academics. That's what we are, right? The notion that there was an outsider that comes in, there was no inside, there was no outside then. I mean, the Galileo's greatest, as you said, greatest foe was a member of a church, right? It was not a fellow scientist that they were arguing with, right? The point being that in modern day, the way to go about changing paradigm is to do that work, to be extremely careful, to do that heavy work, but then also become a member of no one is stopping anyone from coming into academia. I mean, I know you get into ideas of getting a job and all that kind of stuff. That's a whole nother question. But the notion that if you're interested, following through on these issues, this is what your life is, there is a place for you, and there are people who do that as well, and those are what we call academic, right? In a world where that didn't exist, then of course you have individuals who have to then figure out who their allies are politically and so forth to be able to publish their book so that there's a way in which their ideas might be considered, right? That isn't the world we live in today.
You don't think that peer review is a political process?
That's a gross oversimplification of the way in which peer review works, right? The notion of academia is that there are ideas that are fairly and understood. Now, we're all imperfect humans that have our own biases and so forth, of course, but the system that is called academia is meant for that, right? It's not perfect, but that's the mechanism by which ideas are brought out, debated, discussed, and argued. If you are someone who
hold on.
If you're someone who wants to avoid that, as in someone like Graham Hancock, right, or anyone, then of course you will be able to lob from the outside because you want to create that notion. And this is a very important point here because it's something that comes out of a 19th century and 18th century European view of this, that there are these outside scholars or these outside experts that nobody wants to believe. Within academia, there's great diversity of beliefs. You know, there are people who are completely at odds with one another in terms of what they're arguing.
Can somebody without a university position publish in Nature?
That I can't answer. I don't know.
I know
my guess is on what?
Independent scholars outside of universities publish in our journals in, anthropology, all the time, but I don't know about Nature off the top of my head.
But I think that's important.
Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of scholars. They're called academics. There isn't an academic scholar versus a non-academic scholar. Scholars go into academia because that's the institutions that we've created for people who want to do that. If Copernicus were alive today, he'd be an academic, right? And he would argue his cases with his colleagues. And believe me, in academia, there are vitriolic debates about how things go from the smallest to the largest. There is, if you think about one example, for instance, is peopling of the America, right? The history of when modern humans came to the Americas has been a hotly debated argument that has been going on for 30, 40, 50 years. Each side has had or I shouldn't say each side, several sides have had their ability to publish. And if you want to, you can go through the literature and find articles that say one thing, an article that says a second thing, an article that says a third thing. So this notion that there's an academic world that is all in agreement, right? And that someone is outside of that world trying to raise the alarm for new ideas is frankly an incorrect premise about what is happening within academia. Now, we might limit ourselves to what we discussed because we have what are essentially a higher sense, a higher degree of acceptance of certain ideas because of the evidence that's required, not because we don't want them or don't like them, right? That never has been an issue. There's not this notion that academics are all of one mind is exactly the opposite of that. Most academics are of completely different minds with one another, right? Marc and I agree on some things. We disagree on a bunch of other things because we are thinking about things to its finest degree, right? We might agree on 98% of it, but there are 2% we might disagree on. That's what we're going to discuss, right?
And we have very well-known colleagues that, publish all the time, things that are completely opposed to things that other colleagues are publishing. And they're both passed through peer review. So peer review isn't the block that somebody like Hancock would like to pretend that it is, right? Yes, it's designed as a filter, and every filter, whatever it is, will have people that are in support of there being that filter in the first place, and others that say it's too limiting.
I would say
if you have a filter, you have a filter.
My personal experience with peer review, when I've been asked to review articles, I would say about 2/3 of the articles that I'm asked to peer review, I disagree with. None of those do I say shouldn't be published, right?
Yeah.
Because that's not what I'm evaluating. I'm not evaluating whether I agree on with the idea or not. I'm evaluating whether the argument is sound, right?
Is it responsible to the data?
Evidence,
is it citing appropriately people that came before?
Exactly.
Yeah.
I might still disagree with that because they're talking about, let's say, a way of modeling political systems in the ancient Maya that I disagree with, but their evidence is perfectly sound and it's a perfectly reasonable interpretation.
For instance, right? You guys know about the Silurian hypothesis, right?
Yeah, we had Gavin Schmidt on this. We had Gavin and
right.
Yeah, well, it's
Frank.
basically the same kind of thing as Hancock wants to talk about, right?
Sure.
But it was published in a scientific organ because it was presented as a thought experiment. What could we expect to find? What might we not expect to find? There's actually nothing preventing Graham Hancock from publishing in a scientific journal if he wanted to.
But he would have to be Adam Frank or one of these
Gavin Schmidt is the director of the Goddard Space Institute of Science.
Most peer review is entirely anonymous. You don't know who wrote it.
You don't know who wrote it.
But no, hold on. The journal. Hold on. The peer review happens after the journal gets the submission. The person who's getting the submission. Hold on a second. Hold on. I absolutely refuse. This is getting chaotic, but I absolutely refuse the notion that the identity of the person who is sending the paper to the journal doesn't matter. You are reading something that has been filtered by the journal editors who take the first pass to say, do we want to give this person the ability to do this thought experiment? And you cannot and you can point to that and you can be like, hey, it's probably working out the way that it should be. And you can point to it and you can say that
but the journal editors are looking at the value of the idea of the article.
They're also looking at the value of the person.
No.
Sure.
Of course they are. Are you kidding me?
Some journal editors all journal editors are human beings. Some of them might not want to submit it to the rest of their reviewers. But yeah, they would then be not operating appropriately to a journal editor.
Exactly.
Most journal editors that I know would have no resistance to anyone coming up with a neat idea that's going to make a splash, because people don't read journals, as far as journal editors are concerned, nearly enough, right? So getting something that's going to raise people's hackles and get them reading and get them debating and sending in letters to the editors exactly what they want. Mm-hmm. But of course, they can't just make a decision to publish it. They have to send it to their peer reviewers. Exactly. The peer reviewers don't know who sent it. So I have peer-reviewed many hundreds of journal articles over the years, and every so often I can guess who it is, or at least who one of the authors is, because it's in my own specialty. I'm aware with what research people are doing, but 80% or more of the time I have no idea. And I'm only reviewing it on its independent arguments. And when the journal editor who sent it out gets three of the reviews back, and 2 of them are published and 1 of them is not, he publishes it. All 3 of them are published, he publishes it. All 3 of them are don't publish it, he doesn't publish it. But there's nothing stopping Graham Hancock, if he wants to make no money whatsoever and spend time sending to journal editors to publish his ideas. That's not what he wants.
Yeah, this lies beyond
if Copernicus was around today, he would have to publish extensively in some minutia that built on top of something that came before, and have an established career before he would have any chance of publishing such a foundation-shifting idea. Because there was an establishment academy at the time. It was the Ptolemaic tradition from the great academies of the Mediterranean. So
yes, but not the modern university system that we're dealing with now, right? That's a function of something
I mean, the big
else.
problem is the Roman Catholic Church bought into the Ptolemaic system.
Exactly.
The real move was against the faith tradition. I mean, Darwin, too, admits in his own journals that he sat on natural selection for 25 years. It wasn't until he thought he was about to be scooped, right, by Russell Wallace, I always screw up his name, that he was finally moved to get it out there. And it wasn't only the fact that he was pushing against the mores of Britain at the time, right? And the fact that most people were part of either the British Church, right, the Anglican Church, or he was talking about the rest of colleagues in continental Europe, but he didn't want to offend his wife, who was still a believer, her family. Those were the breaks against him publishing his earth-shattering idea.
I will also point out this.
Selection in the 1830s, if he hadn't been afraid of religion. Yeah.
I'll also point out this, which is important, which you mentioned, I think, about the idea of publishing in minutia, right? That's a very important point to keep in mind, because what we're talking about here is that every article, every publication is a dialogue, small as it might be, that leads people to bigger or changing ideas and so forth. So the idea that Copernicus would have developed his ideas slowly over time in a way that isn't after 20 years, here, boom, here's a whole new way of thinking about things, is actually the way that when you have a much more populated academic world, many more people doing this, you have a greater number of people talking, and each person brings in a little piece of that, and it becomes part of a larger discussion or a larger debate that isn't one person changing everything in some kind of quixotic effort to make an impact, right? And that's part of the point. There's absolutely nothing in the way that academia works the way it's supposed to, anyway. Of course, nothing ever works perfectly. We're all humans and so forth, that we've discussed. But the system is meant to allow a multivocality of voices. It really is. Now, that doesn't always work. Of course, if my article gets rejected, which it had in the past, or has to, I get annoyed. Of course I get it. I mean, humans are the way they are.
I've never had an article rejected, so I don't know. Just kidding.
Right? But what did it force me to do? It forced me to read, sit down, and say, what did they want to say? Not to say, oh, they just don't want me to get published because they don't like my ideas. No, I actually read the comments and said, they've got a point here. Maybe they didn't explain it this way, or maybe they misunderstood me entirely, but I have to do a better job of explaining it, right? And you change. And that is the nature of what is essentially a community-based, the notion of multiple voices coming in to create not a single line, one voice, one person. This is my idea. I don't care what anyone else thinks. What the articles are enhanced by the fact that 2, 3, 4 different people bring their perspectives in, and you say, you know what, that's an interesting point, or that's a different take that I didn't think of, and so forth.
And that's a healthy way to share ideas, it seems like, fundamentally to me. Like, you always have a chance when you encounter a new idea, or you're just having what you hope to be a conversation. And unfortunately, it can often devolve into a debate. Like you mentioned when we were talking about, hey, we should call up Grant Hancock right now. And you're like, well, he had a debate with this guy or whatever. And I'm like, the debate is kind of the worst possible way to discuss ideas, because it starts with the premise that I know everything and you know nothing.
That's right.
And ideally, what we want to have in science and in our culture and in society is the ability to make that little tiny sacrifice of, hey, I might not know everything. Like, I've been working really hard my whole career and I'm a smart dude, but there's a slight possibility that I don't know everything here, and I could learn something from you. And
I will say this: when someone goes off onto, and this has happened to me in smaller ways as well, but if you are an isolated, if you're an isolate, right, that is, you're going up with your ideas and so forth, and you're developing it over time. For instance, during COVID, where interaction really went down quite a bit, so when you're kind of thinking about ideas and so forth, you might write something and you realize, oh wow, I've been in a bit of isolation. I need other people to read this stuff for me first. Every article that I have published has been vetted by my students or my colleagues. I give out drafts, right? What do you think? Same thing happens that happened to me, right? So nothing that I write gets out there simply because I want it to be said. I think about what I'm trying to say and trying to understand what I'd like to explain as a model of something X, Y, and Z, even if it is transformative, right? Paradigmatically transformative, right? That doesn't happen with one kind of, hole in one shot. It happens with a body of work that leads to a conclusion. And that's what would have happened in many of the cases of, let's say, Darwin or Copernicus, publishing one observation after another, leading to a body of work that then leads you to say, you know what? There's something interesting here. Graham Hancock could have done that in an infinite number of times, even before writing a book that explains everything, right? You could have written article after article or proposed article after article and said if it would work, to see how his theory fits in with what we know about Egypt or what we know about Malta or what we know about Turkey and so forth, and then be part of a conversation. No one's stopping him. No one would have ever stopped him in the past either, right? But as Marc says, that's thankless work. That's small work. That is what we do, and that's what we do in academia. I find myself extremely lucky. I often say this, I can't believe I get paid to do the stuff I do, right? We don't get paid a lot, like most people, right? But that's the price you pay for being able to do something that you will want to do for the next 40 years. That's the part, and I will say this, that's the part that's frustrating about so much of this dynamic with folks like this, which is that this notion of being outsiders to something, no one is keeping them outside.
It's productive to them. I mean, that isolation affords them the totalitarian perspective, right?
And it creates this notion that within academia we are a cabal of some kind that are all in agreement. The worst criticisms I've ever received about any of my work come from members in academia that are telling me that I'm totally wrong. That's hard to take. I mean, but that's part of the growth process. So this notion that there isn't disagreement, that there aren't alternative views and so forth, I think is a false one that really misses the point of the issues that we have with this particular individual. I will also tell you more jocularly, there's not a single archaeologist I know, including myself and Marc, who, if we found evidence of some kind of 10,000-year-old or 15,000-year-old civilization, wouldn't be publishing it immediately, right? With appropriate evidence. If I had a radiocarbon dating saying, oh my God, there's something I don't know, wherever you might be able to find it, whether it's Antarctica or whatnot, right? Now, Sahara Desert. Now I know the argument there, and I'll get to that in a moment, but there's not a single individual that wouldn't try to publish it like that. They wouldn't say, oh, this is so crazy that no one will want to publish it for me. No, not at all. If you have the evidence for it, publish it, right? And let the chips fall where they may. Honestly, that's really the way it's supposed to work. Does it work that way all the time? Of course not. Is it perfect? No. But that's its function.
When you start to see it that way, it makes sense that there's sort of a self-serving element to viewing it from the lens of, insulating yourself from the kind of criticism that you might actually enjoy to improve your theory, but you treat it as an adversarial situation instead, which I really do think promotes the kind of tyranny of ideology. But listen, gentlemen, we've done 3 hours already.
This is great.
Yeah, it's been really fun to talk to you. I would love to talk to you guys again. If you guys would be open to it, we could meet up again down the line a little bit, because I feel like there's actually so much more. There's so much more we didn't even get into with this.
I feel we've talked a little bit about classic Maya civilization, origins, and collapse, and a little bit about pseudo-archaeology. There's plenty more fascinating topics.
Yeah, absolutely. Where can folks find out more about what you guys are working on? Do you have lab websites? Do you do social media, anything like that? Books coming out that folks can check out?
We both have pretty active academia.edu sites. Things we find our published literature there, both books and articles. Obviously, we publish mostly in our specialty. So my material is, Maya decipherment, Maya languages and language history. Marcello's papers and publications are about archaeological fieldwork in Honduras and in Guatemala. Also, of course, the new LIDAR work, and particularly the revolutionary idea of the size of the populations. And so that's a good first place to go. And I think most of that most of that material, probably even your science article, would that be on your academia?
I think so. I think that's
site?
mostly
Yeah.
on academia, academia.edu or the DOI numbers. I can't never remember, or DIO. I forget what the initials are. For articles that are just
DOI,
on, nothing's printed anymore.
Yeah, that's true. It's all digital.
pages.
It's true.
But
Yeah,
but
our
also,
university websites basically link back there for
Right.
a single clearinghouse for information. So that would be a good place to go. Yeah.
Also, the Mari website would be nice if you wanted to link that. I think that's just mari.tulane.edu, mari.tulane.edu. That sort of is the institute that kind of houses us and so forth.
Excellent.
Is that enough?
Yeah,
we
that's
don't
a
really
great
have
place to start. Read the
social
literature,
media
people.
Presence in
Read the literature. Do your
We
homework.
should get a YouTube channel one day, but no, nothing like that yet. Yeah.
All right. Well, we got you for now.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank you so much. This has been illuminating. I really welcome the opportunity to review my understanding of the history of the world in a way that can inform what's happening right now, and ultimately what we might do to buttress our own situation against potential natural and civilization level threats. And yeah, it's really fascinating. I have a lot to think about. So thank you guys for coming by. I really appreciate it.
It was really good.
You're welcome.
It was a real
You're welcome.
pleasure. Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Absolutely.